Welcome to Black Screen Horror Tonight. 3 hours of true scary stories and disturbing encounters. Ads may play in the first 15 minutes, and after 2:30 hawks, no mid-rolls in between. Lights off. Eyes closed. Let the nightmare begin. On my mother's side of the family, there's an old story that gets passed down at holidays about a great-great-grandmother back in the old country who could talk to the dead and had a gift for keeping the bad ones out of a house. Nobody in my family says it like it's a joke. My mom barely sleeps more than a few hours a night, and most of that broken rest is spent, by her own account, visiting with her parents, both long gone, who ask her how I'm doing and whether I'm eating enough. Whatever came down through the women in our family, it seems to have split unevenly between us. My mom got the warm side of it. I got the other side, the kind of company that doesn't ask how you're doing at all. My grandmother, my mom's mother, died the spring before we moved into the house where most of this happened, and I still carry a version of guilt about it that I've never said out loud to anyone. I was supposed to visit her the weekend she passed, and I begged out of it because a friend was having a birthday thing I didn't want to miss. She died 2 days later in her sleep, and I never got to see her again outside of the funeral home. My mom talked to her constantly after that in dreams and quiet moments in the kitchen. I never did. I used to lie awake wanting some sign that she wasn't angry with me and getting nothing at all while somehow still getting plenty of company from things that were very much not her. The house we moved into that winter was a strange split kind of place, half very old and half brand new, sitting on a couple of acres at the edge of a small town outside Chicago. The original part of the house was close to 100 years old. A tall farmhouse with a steep roof and narrow upstairs hallway shaped like a sideways T. Our bedrooms at the top of the stairs and my parents' room down at the far end past the bathroom. My dad had bought it as a foreclosure, cheap enough that he could afford to build an addition onto the back of it, a new wing that was still mostly exposed studs and hanging wire when we moved in, meant to eventually be a family room downstairs and an extra bedroom above it, connected to the old part of the house by a short hallway that always smelled like fresh lumber no matter how many months passed. My dad worked on that addition most weekends, and for a long time it felt more like a project than a real part of our home, half-finished and separate from everything else. The man who'd owned the house before us had lost his mind in some serious, specific way my parents never explained in detail in front of me. Only that he'd been taken somewhere he could get real help and had signed the place over not long after. The house had sat empty for close to 2 years before we bought it, and my mom spent the first few weeks scrubbing and airing it out room by room, muttering under her breath the whole time about the state some men let a house get into. I was 6 that winter, and I remember being too busy just being 6 to pay attention to any of the stories that came with the place. That came later, once the storm started. Before any of that, though, the house was just cold and unfamiliar in ordinary ways. The floors upstairs sloped slightly toward the T-junction in the hallway, enough that a dropped marble would roll there on its own, and my dad blamed it on a century of settling every time I mentioned it. The new addition smelled like sawdust and fresh caulk, and I used to like standing in the framed-out shell of what would eventually be a family room, looking up at the exposed rafters, pretending it was a fort rather than half a house. My mom spent those first few weeks scrubbing every surface of the old wing twice over, muttering under her breath about the state some men let a house fall into, though she never explained exactly what she meant by that. And I didn't think to ask. We didn't know much about the man who'd lived there before us, only what my parents let slip in front of me by accident. He'd been a widower, my dad said once, who'd started talking to himself around the property in his last year there, until a nephew finally stepped in and had him taken somewhere he could be looked after properly. The house had sat empty a long while after that, long enough that the yard had gone completely wild before my dad ever saw the foreclosure listing. None of that seemed strange to me at 6 years old. Old houses came with old owners. I didn't think there was anything else to it. That particular winter brought a string of brutal ice storms through our part of the state, the kind that coated every branch in glass and dropped whole trees onto power lines for days at a stretch. Our power went out for the first time in early January, and my parents built up the fire in the old stone fireplace downstairs to keep the main part of the house warm while we waited it out. I remember needing to shower that first night, and since the pipes in the little upstairs bathroom by our bedrooms had frozen solid, I had to go all the way down the long hallway to use my parents' bathroom instead, past the T-junction where the hall split alone, with a candle in one hand. I remember standing at the top of the stairs for a second before I went, listening to my parents' voices down below near the fire, and thinking to myself that if I hurried, I'd be back down with them in no time. I don't actually remember the shower itself, just the feeling of the water going lukewarm faster than it should have. What I remember clearly is standing in my room afterward, realizing I'd forgotten to bring my pajamas in with me, and hearing a small giggle behind me while my back was still turned to the closet. I looked at the closet first, certain that was where the sound had come from, and felt, in that specific way a kid can feel before they have the words for it, like something was watching me from inside it. Then I heard the giggle again, closer from the direction of my bedroom door instead, and when I turned, something small and dark was sliding out from behind it, low to the ground at first, the way smoke curls out from under something before it stands up straight. It looked like a kid about my own size, but made of something closer to soot than skin. Its edges never quite still, always drifting slightly like ash caught in a draft, tiny flecks of it, lifting off and disappearing before they hit the floor. It didn't have a face I could describe, just a smoothness where one should have been. But I remember its breath, or whatever passed for breath, coming out in small, visible puffs of cold vapor each time it giggled. The way your breath fogs outside on a freezing morning, except there was no mouth for it to come from that I could see. I told it, in the flattest voice a 6-year-old can manage, that it wasn't allowed to be there, and it needed to go. I don't remember choosing to say that. It just came out of me, the way you tell a stray dog to get off the porch. It didn't listen. It started walking toward me instead, still giggling, and I could feel more than think that it wanted to play with me the way another kid might, except every part of me understood that whatever it wanted wasn't a game I was allowed to say yes to. It was in front of me before I fully registered it closing the distance, and I did the only thing my body knew how to do, which was kick out at it as hard as I could. My foot went straight through where its middle should have been, into nothing but cold air, and that was when I finally started screaming and ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time in the dark, straight into the light of the fire and my parents' arms. They chalked it up to the storm, to the strange house, to a kid's imagination running wild in the dark with no power on. And for a while, I let them believe that, because the alternative felt too big to say out loud. Privately, in my own head, I started calling it the Ash Boy. And once I'd given it that much of a name, I started seeing it more often, always at night, always some version of that same slow approach and giggle. Though I got better over time at not screaming every single time. My dad, in those early weeks, was the one who kept a level head about all of it. The way he'd kept a level head about the sloped floors and the cold spots, and every other strange thing the house had thrown at us so far. He checked the window latches in my room twice after I told him about the giggling, tightened a loose hinge on my closet door that had never quite sat right, and told me more than once that old houses made noises that could trick a kid's ears in the dark, especially with a fire crackling downstairs and the wind doing what it was doing outside. I wanted to believe him. Some nights I almost did. About 3 weeks after the first outage, my mom was clearing out debris from under the old part of the house's upstairs hallway floor, in the T-junction where the boards had always felt slightly uneven underfoot, and found that one of the old iron floor vents there wasn't seated flush the way the others were. When she pried it up to check for a blockage, there was a hollow space beneath it. And inside that space, wrapped in a moth-eaten cloth, she found an old ornamental dagger with a segmented sheath, the kind you'd expect to see mounted on a wall rather than hidden under a floor, and beneath that, a small stack of photographs. The photographs weren't of anything I understood as frightening at first glance, just pictures of the empty rooms of our house, taken, my mom guessed, sometime before we ever moved in, back when the previous owner still lived there alone. It was only after she'd gone through all of them twice that she went pale and called my dad over and pointed at something in nearly every single photo. A small dark smudge tucked into a corner or standing just inside a doorway at the edge of the frame, a shape about the size of a child, in a house that was supposed to have been completely empty when those pictures were taken. My dad went quiet looking at those photographs in a way I hadn't seen from him before, turning each one over to check the back as if a date or a name might explain any of it away. There wasn't anything written on any of them. He set the whole stack down on the kitchen table that night and didn't touch them again, and it was the first time I saw him reach for the phone to call someone. A locksmith he knew from work, just to ask, in a roundabout way that didn't quite say what he meant, whether there was such a thing as sealing a floor vent for good rather than just covering it. The locksmith gave him the name of a sheet metal supplier and nothing else, and my dad thanked him and hung up, looking no less unsettled than before. I sat at that kitchen table, too, small enough that nobody thought to send me out of the room, and I remember picking up one of the photographs myself before my mom noticed and took it gently out of my hands. In the half second I held it, I saw the little dark shape standing just inside a closet door in what I recognized as my own bedroom, in a photograph taken long before we ever owned a single piece of furniture in that house. And something in my chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the broken heat. My mom didn't sleep much that night, and not for the usual reason. The next evening, she started doing something I'd never seen her do before, walking slowly through every room of the house with a small bundle of dried herbs smoldering in an old dish, murmuring words in the language her own grandmother used to use, pausing in doorways and corners the way you'd pause to check a lock. She told me it was something her mother had taught her, meant for pushing bad things back out of a house, and that she'd never needed it before. Not like this. I felt whatever had prompted it too that same night, a kind of pressure behind my eyes that made me want to keep every light in the house on, though of course half our lights weren't working anyway. It became a pattern after that. Some nights I'd wake to the smell of that same smoldering bundle drifting under my door, and I'd know without being told that my mom had felt something crawl awake somewhere in the house and had gotten up to meet it before it could get any closer to either of us. Months went by like that, cold spells and thaws trading places outside, my dad slowly closing in the walls of the new addition on weekends oblivious for a long time to most of what was happening on our side of the house. There was a stretch in February where nothing happened at all, long enough that my mom stopped burning her herbs every night and I let myself sleep with my closet door shut instead of watching it. I remember telling her once during that quiet stretch that maybe the Ash Boy had finally listened to me, and she'd given me a look I didn't understand yet. Tired and a little sad. The look of someone who knew better than to trust a house that had gone quiet before. Then one night in late winter, unable to sleep in my own room, I climbed into bed between my parents, the way I still did back then when the dark felt too big. I woke sometime after that, freezing despite the extra body heat around me, and knew before I even opened my eyes that something was standing at the foot of the bed. I made myself look. The Ash Boy was there, exactly as I knew him, but he wasn't alone. Two larger shapes stood on either side of him, made of the same drifting soot, taller, adult-sized, utterly still in a way that felt worse than any movement would have. All three of them were facing the bed, watching my sleeping parents with what I can only describe as patience. The unhurried patience of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. I told them, in the same flat voice I'd used the first time, that they had to leave, that they weren't wanted here, that this wasn't their house to stand in. I don't know where a 6-year-old finds the nerve to say something like that twice, except that some part of me understood even then that fear alone wasn't going to be enough. All three shapes seemed to lean back slightly, like smoke drawing itself in, and faded apart into nothing. The cold going with them so completely that I found myself sweating a few minutes later under the blankets. I never saw the two larger shapes again after that night, but the Ash Boy stayed, showing up less often as the weeks passed, enough that I let myself believe, the way kids do, that things were finally getting better. My dad, once my mom finally told him everything, about the vent and the photographs and the herbs and the cold spots, didn't argue with any of it the way I expected him to. He just went quiet for a few days and then bolted a heavy metal plate over that section of vent himself, screwing it down tight enough that it took real effort to pry off. More out of wanting to do something with his hands than any real belief, I think. Though I'm not sure anymore how much of that was true belief, and how much was just love making room for the impossible. For a while after the plate went in, life almost felt ordinary again. My dad got the drywall up in most of the new addition, taping and sanding seams on weekends with the radio going, and my mom's herb ritual settled into something closer to habit than emergency. A slow walk through the house every few nights rather than every single one. I started sleeping in my own bed again instead of climbing in with my parents, and though I still checked the closet before I turned my lamp off, most nights nothing answered back. I remember thinking, with the particular confidence only a kid can have, that whatever we'd found under that floor had been the whole problem, and that sealing it away had solved it, the way boarding up a broken window solves a draft. The worst ice storm of that whole winter hit us in early March, knocking the power out for almost 4 days straight, longer than any outage before it. On the second night of that outage, my dad went out to the truck to check on a generator he'd rigged up for the fridge, and my mom was downstairs banking the fire for the night, and I needed the bathroom again. The same long walk down the same T-shaped hallway I'd made that very first night, months earlier, candle in hand, feeling that same old prickle at the back of my neck that told me I wasn't walking that hallway alone. The metal plate over the vent had been pried halfway up when I reached the junction, one corner bent back like a lid. And before I understood what I was looking at, something cold closed around my ankle from below, right through the gap, a grip with more pressure points pressed into my skin than 5 fingers should have made, giggling rising up out of the opening in that same small, delighted way I'd heard 100 times by then, except closer now, hungrier, pulling instead of just watching. I went down hard onto the floorboards, candle rolling away and guttering out, my hands scrabbling for anything to hold on to while whatever had my ankle kept pulling steadily toward the vent, the 2 taller shapes rising up out of the opening on either side of the smaller one this time, their cold rolling off them in a wave that made my chest hurt to breathe against. I screamed for my mom the way I hadn't screamed since that very first night, and I heard her feet hit the stairs almost before the sound had finished leaving me. She got to me fast enough to grab both my arms and haul back with everything she had, shouting words in that same old language she'd been using, with the herbs, no candle or dish of smoke this time, just her voice cutting through the dark like she meant to physically push the sound of it into the gap in the floor. Whatever had my ankle held on hard enough that I felt something give in my skin before it finally let go all at once, and my mom and I went sprawling backward together into the hallway wall, the metal plate slamming down over the vent on its own with a bang loud enough that my dad came running in from outside, still holding his flashlight, asking what in God's name had happened before either of us could get a word out. For a moment after the plate slammed shut, none of us moved, the 3 of us just breathing hard in the dark hallway, my mom's arms still locked around me, my dad's flashlight beam shaking slightly where it landed on the bent corner of metal. The quiet that followed felt different from the ordinary quiet of a powerless house at night. It felt like something on the other side of that floor was still listening, deciding whether it had gotten enough of what it wanted for one night. In the light of that flashlight, my ankle already showed a ring of dark, frost-pale marks pressed into the skin, cold to the touch in a way that lingered for hours, no matter how many blankets we piled onto me, the pattern of it uneven, more points of pressure crowded into the flesh than a hand should have left. My dad knelt there, running his thumb along the marks the same disbelieving way he'd once run it along carpet indentations that didn't belong to any furniture. And this time, he didn't offer up an explanation. He just held onto my leg like letting go of it might let something take it back, sitting there on the cold floorboards with my mom's arms still locked around my shoulders. I remember thinking, in the strange sideways way fear makes you think about things that don't matter yet, that this was the closest anything had ever come to actually touching me, and that some part of me had almost expected it to hurt more or differently than it did. It didn't burn the way I thought cold that deep should burn. It just ached, steady and patient, like it wanted me to remember exactly how it had felt long after the marks themselves faded. We didn't wait for morning to deal with the vent. My dad went out to the shed in the dark and came back with a thicker steel plate and a fistful of long screws, and my mom stood over him the whole time with her bundle of herbs lit again, murmuring without pause until every screw was seated, and the metal wasn't giving so much as a fraction of an inch when he tested it with his boot. She poured a line of coarse salt along the seam of the plate afterward, something she said her own mother had done once for a door that wouldn't stay closed, and none of us slept much the rest of that night, sitting together in front of the fire, until the sky outside finally started to gray. Things went quiet after that, quiet enough over the following weeks that I let myself believe, the way I had once before, that we'd finally won something. The ash boy didn't show up at the foot of any bed. The hallway stopped carrying that particular cold. My dad kept working on the new addition, on a weekends, closer now to drywall and paint than exposed studs. And my mom's smoldering herb bundle started coming out less and less often until whole weeks passed without the smell of it drifting under my door at all. I still thought about my grandmother most nights before I fell asleep, the way I had every night since the funeral, waiting for some small sign, the way my mom seemed to get them so easily. A dream, a smell, anything at all that might mean she'd forgiven me for not being there. Nothing ever came, not through that whole long winter. And I'd started to believe by spring that whatever gift ran through the women in my family had simply decided I wasn't owed that particular kindness, only the other kind of company. The kind that didn't ask how I was doing and didn't care whether I'd been a good granddaughter or not. My mom caught me crying about it once, quietly, into my pillow, and she sat with me a long while without saying much, just smoothing my hair back the same way my grandmother used to, and told me that the gift didn't always work the way you wanted it to, that sometimes it just gave you what was closest, whether or not that was any comfort at all. One quiet night in early spring, with the addition close enough to finish that my dad had started sleeping out there some nights just to feel the progress, I woke to a smell I hadn't caught in almost a year, faint and warm, like the rosewater soap my grandmother used to keep by her bathroom sink, the kind of smell that used to mean her hands on my hair before bed. For one long, aching minute, lying there in the dark, I let myself believe it was her, that whatever gift ran through the women in my family had finally decided to let a little of its warmth reach me too, the way it always reached my mom. And I didn't even feel the cold creeping in until the rosewater smell was already gone, smothered under something colder and sootier that I knew far too well by then. The giggle that followed didn't come from the direction of the old hallway or the sealed vent at all. It came from further back in the house, past the little connecting hall that still smelled faintly of sawdust. From somewhere inside the new addition, my dad had spent the whole winter building with his own hands. In the morning, on the inside of the freshly hung drywall in what was going to be the new bedroom, low near the baseboard where no vent or opening had ever existed, there was a single small handprint, pressed into the white paint in fine gray soot. 5 fingers spread wide, already smudged slightly at the edges, the way ash does when something is still, very faintly moving. My dad stood in front of that wall for a long time before he said anything, one hand hovering near it without quite touching. And my mom didn't reach for her herbs that morning the way she had every other time. Something new turned up. She just stood in the doorway of that half-finished room, looking at a mark that had appeared inside a wall he'd built himself, with his own 2 hands, in a part of the house that had never once been old. My dad died in the field behind our house almost 3 years before any of this happened. And I've never told anyone, not even my mom, that the last thing I said to him was that I didn't want to go out there with him that night. He'd heard something moving around near the fence line and wanted company walking the flashlight out to check it. And I was 14 and annoyed about something that doesn't even matter anymore. And I told him to go by himself. He did. A neighbor found him the next morning near the tree line at the far edge of the field, and the coroner called it exposure and a fall, though I remember overhearing my mom on the phone once, months later, asking someone why a simple fall would leave marks like that on a grown man's arms. Nobody ever explained what she meant by that in front of me, and I never asked, though I've turned that half-heard question over in my head more times than I can count in the years since. We kept living in that house anyway, because my mom said she wasn't going to let a bad night take the whole rest of our life along with it. And mostly, we managed. She went back to work, I went back to school, and we got good at not talking about the field behind our house except in the most ordinary terms. Mowing it, complaining about the mosquitoes near the low spot, deciding whether it was worth putting a proper fence up someday. Some part of that quiet arrangement between us depended on neither of us ever saying what we were both privately avoiding, which was the tree line at the very back, the one place on our whole property neither of us walked toward anymore without a reason. The field itself stretched out behind every house on our side of the road, a long, flat stretch of grass that ran to a low rise with two big old trees on top of it, and then dropped down into another flat stretch before it hit a line of trees at the very back, where the houses on that far side never bothered putting up porch lights. My dad used to take me out to sit under those two trees on the rise sometimes, just to talk. Back when I still thought there was nothing in the world our yard couldn't handle. And even after he was gone, I kept going out there with my friends, more out of stubbornness than anything healthy, I think now. My mom never went out that far into the field herself anymore. Not since the morning she'd had to walk out there with a police officer to identify exactly where the neighbor had found him. She still kept his old flashlight in the kitchen drawer nearest the back door, the same one he'd carried out that night. And I used to see her pick it up sometimes, just to turn it over in her hands before putting it back, never actually using it, like she was checking it was still real. 2 years ago, on a dark night in early fall, I was out there with my two closest friends, a girl named Paige, who lived 2 houses down from me, and a boy named Marcus, who lived across the street from her. Nobody in Marcus's life had ever called him anything but his full name. Not his own parents, not his teachers, not even the coach who gave everyone else on the baseball team a nickname within a week of meeting them. It was just one of those small, unexplainable things about him. And none of us ever thought to ask why. The same way none of us ever thought too hard about why our particular stretch of field had 2 trees standing together on that rise when the rest of it was flat and empty for acres in every direction. It was about 10 at night, and Paige and I were up in the branches of one of the 2 trees while Marcus sat on the ground below us, with his back against the trunk, all 3 of us doing the kind of aimless talking teenagers do when there's nowhere better to be, half watching the last bit of daylight drain out of the sky over the far tree line. Marcus shouted something out suddenly, cutting off whatever Paige had been saying, and both of us looked where he was pointing, toward the far dark end of the field, where the unlit houses sat behind their line of trees. It took me a few seconds of staring to actually understand what I was looking at. There were shapes out there, maybe 8 of them, moving together across the grass, and my brain kept trying to sort them into something ordinary and failing every time. They were built heavy through the shoulders like bears, but moved with the long, easy stride of deer, standing and running mostly upright on back legs shaped almost like a gorilla's, using their front limbs to push off the ground every few strides the way a gorilla knuckle walks. I want to say they had hooves, because that's the closest word I have for what their feet looked like in the dark, though I never got close enough to be sure. The worst part, the part that still comes back to me at random moments even now, was how silent they were. Something that size, moving that fast across open ground, should have made noise, hoofbeats or breathing or the grass whipping against their legs, and there was nothing. Just 8 huge shapes crossing that field in dead silence, moving together in a loose, unhurried formation that somehow felt more disturbing than if they'd been scattered. Like a group of people walking somewhere, they all already knew the way too. Paige's hand found my arm at some point and gripped it hard enough to leave marks of her own the next day. And Marcus had gone completely still below us, not even shifting his weight against the trunk. The three of us frozen in that tree, like the stillness itself might keep whatever was out there from noticing us in return. They broke into a full sprint a few seconds after we spotted them, cutting across the second flat stretch of the field toward the dark tree line at the far end. There was a house down that way with a chain-link fence and a few trees along its edge, and the yard around it happened to be one of the better-lit spots along that whole stretch, since the owners kept a floodlight running over their shed. I remember watching those shapes get closer to that light, waiting to see them silhouetted against it, the way anything running through there should have been. And then they simply weren't there anymore, not jumping the fence, not veering around the trees. They hit that dark edge and stopped existing, all 8 of them, between one stride and the next, the field going back to ordinary, empty grass so completely that for one dizzy second, I almost convinced myself none of us had seen anything at all. We ran back to my house so fast I don't remember most of the actual running, just bursting through the back door into the kitchen with Paige, nearly in tears, and Marcus white as a sheet. All 3 of us talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen to my mom. She listened, the way she always did. But I could see her doing the same thing every adult does when a kid describes something impossible, quietly sorting through a list of ordinary explanations. She guessed deer, maybe a pack of dogs that had gotten loose from somewhere, something spooked by a car or another animal, shapes that get stranger and bigger in your memory the more scared you were in the moment. She walked us all back out with a flashlight anyway, out to the edge of our own yard, and found nothing in the grass to prove or disprove any of it. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing except the ordinary quiet of a field at night, which felt different to me now than it had an hour before. Marcus's parents drove over to pick him up not long after, and I remember his mom standing in our kitchen listening to him tell it all over again, her face doing the same careful, patient thing my mom's had, nodding along without quite agreeing, one hand resting on his shoulder the whole time, like she needed to feel him standing there, solid in front of her. Paige stayed the night at my place instead of walking the short distance home, and neither of us slept much, lying awake in my room with the lamp on, listening to every ordinary sound the house made, like it might be the start of something. For the next few nights, nothing happened at all, and I let myself half believe my mom's explanations, the way you want to believe the version of things that lets you sleep. Then, about a week later, our old dog, Rusty, who'd never once in his life refused to go out the back door, planted his feet on the porch one night and would not step off it, ears back, a low sound coming out of him that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine either. My mom had to physically coax him down the steps to do his business, and even then he stayed close to the house, glancing back toward the field every few seconds like he expected something to come up out of the dark grass after him. About 10 days after the sighting, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes just after dusk when I caught movement out past the porch, low and quick along the tree line at the edge of our own yard, much closer than the far end of the field where we'd first seen anything. I only caught a glimpse before it dropped back into the shadow of the trees, but it was enough to make out that same heavy, hunched shape moving on legs that bent the wrong way for anything I knew the name of. I stood frozen at that sink with soapy water running cold over my hands until my mom came in and asked what was wrong, and when I told her, she went straight to the back door and flipped on every outdoor light we had, standing in the doorway, scanning the dark yard for a long, silent minute before locking up early for the night. After that evening, we started keeping the porch light on until morning, no matter the electric bill, and my mom took to checking the yard from the window every hour or so before bed, out of a habit neither of us discussed out loud. It became one of those things a family just starts doing, the way you'd start double-checking a stove burner after a scare, without ever agreeing in words that anything had changed. A few nights after that, I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound I couldn't place at first. A slow, heavy, dragging noise coming from somewhere underneath the house. Our farmhouse had a crawl space running the length of it, accessible through a low hatch built into the skirting under the back porch, mostly used for storing old paint cans and a few boxes nobody wanted in the actual basement. I lay there for a long time, listening to that dragging sound move from one end of the crawl space to the other and back again, slow and deliberate, before it finally stopped. And I didn't tell my mom about it until the next morning, half convinced I'd dreamed it, though some part of me had lain there counting the seconds between each drag, the way you count between lightning and thunder, trying to guess how far away it really was. She didn't dismiss it the way I expected her to. Instead, she got a flashlight and walked out to the crawlspace hatch herself before school and found the little wooden door hanging slightly open, though she was sure she'd latched it the last time she'd been under there checking a pipe months earlier. In the dirt just inside the opening, there were prints, strange, elongated shapes, part hoof and part something with too many separate points pressed into the soil. Nothing like a deer's clean split print, and nothing like a dog's either. She stood there a long moment with the flashlight aimed at them before she finally latched the little door again and told me not to go poking around under the porch until she had someone look at it, her voice carrying that particular calm she used when she wanted me to believe she wasn't as rattled as she looked. That someone turned out to be our neighbor's husband, a practical, unhurried man who fixed his own tractor and didn't put much stock in anything he couldn't explain with a socket wrench. He crawled under the porch himself with a headlamp, came back out 10 minutes later with dirt on his knees and no real answer, saying it might have been a big dog or a coyote that had gotten in looking for shelter, and that he'd patched the hatch with a stronger latch just in case. He didn't offer any story about the house or the field, didn't act like he knew more than he was saying. Just did the practical thing a practical man does and left it at that. It didn't make me feel any better. If anything, watching a grown man come up from under our house looking that unsettled made it worse. I asked him before he left whether he'd ever heard of anything strange happening out past the 2 trees on the rise, and he was quiet for a second, too long before he said no, not that he knew of, and got in his truck. I believed the words. I didn't believe the pause in front of them, the way his eyes had flicked once toward the back of our property before he answered, quick enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't already been watching for exactly that kind of tell. It was while my mom and I were clearing out some of the old boxes from the crawl space ourselves, getting ready for the new latch to go in, that we found the glove. It was one of my dad's old work gloves, the leather kind he used to wear splitting wood, half buried near the very back corner of the crawl space, where the dragging sound had seemed to originate from that night. We had never found that pair after he died. My mom had looked for them for weeks afterwards, certain he'd had them on the night he went out to check the fence line, since the other glove had turned up in the mudroom the morning after. Alone, she sat back on her heels holding that single glove for a long time, not saying anything. And I didn't ask her what she was thinking, because I was thinking the same thing, and neither of us wanted to say it out loud. I remember the particular quality of that silence, crouched together in the dim crawl space with a single work light hanging from a nail. My mom turning that stiff old glove over and over in her hands like she might find some sensible answer stitched into the seams if she looked long enough. She finally set it down on top of one of the boxes, gently, the way you'd set down something that belonged to a person rather than a thing, and told me we should finish up and get some air. Neither of us went back down into that crawl space again after that day, not once, not even to grab the paint cans she'd originally wanted. After that, the quiet nights stopped being quiet. The crickets that usually kept up a steady noise out past the porch, some nights simply weren't there at all. An absence I only noticed because of how loud it made the rest of the house feel by comparison. Every creak of a floorboard or tick of the furnace suddenly much louder than it should have been. The air near the crawlspace hatch carried a heavy, wet, earthy smell some evenings, thick enough that my mom mentioned it too without my having to say anything first. Something neither of us could pin to mud or the septic line or anything ordinary, no matter how many times we checked. Rusty stopped sleeping in his usual spot, by the back door around then, moving his bed into my room instead, without anyone deciding that for him. And some nights I'd wake to find him sitting up stiff and alert at the foot of my bed, ears pointed toward the wall that faced the crawl space, a low sound coming from him that never quite turned into a bark. My mom started leaving the hallway light on all night, something she hadn't done since I was small enough to be scared of the dark on my own account, rather than for any real reason. We told Paige and Marcus some of it, not all. Enough that Paige stopped coming over after dark, and Marcus started finding reasons to walk the long way around by the road instead of cutting through the field like he used to. Neither of them said the word haunted to me, and I didn't say it to them either, though I think all three of us were circling around the same idea without wanting to be the one to land on it first. Marcus asked me once, in that careful, sideways way you ask something you're half afraid to hear answered, whether I thought it had anything to do with my dad, and I told him I didn't know, which was true then in a way. It isn't quite true anymore. The new latch held for almost 2 weeks before the night it didn't. A storm had rolled through that evening, heavy rain that had mostly cleared out by the time I went to bed, leaving the ground outside soft and the air unusually still. My mom had gone around the house checking every window latch twice before we turned in that night. A habit she'd picked up somewhere in those 2 weeks without ever announcing it as a new rule. And I remember lying awake listening to the last of the rain drip off the gutters, telling myself the storm was the only reason the night felt so loaded, so close to something. I woke sometime after midnight to that same dragging sound, closer now, right up against the crawlspace wall on the side nearest my bedroom. And under it, low and rhythmic, something that might have been breathing if anything that size could breathe without making more noise than that. I got up to check on my mom's insistence that we tell her the moment we heard anything again, and found her already awake in the hallway. Flashlight in hand, the beam trained on the back door, which stood open a few inches despite both of us remembering it locked. We went out onto the porch together, and the new latch on the crawlspace hatch had been forced outward, bent nearly flat, the little wooden door hanging by one hinge. My mom told me to stay back, and of course I didn't, following her down the porch steps toward the hatch with my heart slamming against my ribs, the wet grass soaking through my socks with every step. the porch light throwing our two shadows out long and thin across the yard toward the dark opening under the house. She crouched down to look inside just as something surged out of the opening toward her. Faster than anything that size should have been able to move in a space that low and cramped, and a heavy limb, thick as a bear's forearm but jointed wrong, bending backward at a place no elbow should bend, wrapped around her ankle and pulled. She went down hard onto the wet ground, scrabbling at the grass, and I grabbed the first thing my hands found, an old rake leaning against the porch rail, and swung it as hard as I could at whatever had hold of her. I felt it connect with something solid and unyielding, like hitting packed earth, and for one horrible second I was close enough to see part of what had come out of that hatch. A wide, heavy-muzzled face, with no visible eyes at all, just smooth, dark hide running unbroken from brow to jaw, and a scent rolling off it like wet fur and turned soil, thick enough to catch in the back of my throat, even over the smell of rain. The flashlight had rolled from my mom's hand when she fell, its beam pointing sideways across the grass, catching just enough of the shape to show me the rest of it wasn't alone. Further back in the black opening of the hatch, low to the ground, I could make out at least one more set of limbs shifting in the dark, waiting, unhurried, the way something waits when it already knows how a struggle like this usually ends. That patience scared me worse than the grip on my mom's ankle did. It scared me because it meant this wasn't panic or hunger driving it. It was choosing to take its time. Whatever grip it had on her loosened just enough for me to grab her other arm and haul, both of us scrambling backward together across the grass while the thing retreated into the dark beneath the porch with a speed that made no sense for something its size. Gone in under 2 seconds, leaving nothing behind but torn up grass and the bent, ruined latch swinging loose in the dark. My mom's ankle showed deep bruising in an odd banded pattern by morning, not quite a hand's grip and not quite a hoof either. The skin split in 2 places in a way that needed actual stitches at the clinic in town. The doctor there frowning at the wound and asking twice what exactly had bitten or grabbed her, without either of us having a real answer to give. She told him she caught it on a piece of farm equipment in the dark, and he wrote that down without much conviction, the way you write down an answer you don't quite believe because there isn't a better one on offer. He gave her a tetanus shot just in case and told her to keep it clean and elevated. Standard instructions for an injury he clearly didn't think matched the story he'd just been given, and neither of us corrected him on the way out. We didn't sleep in that house that week. We stayed with my aunt 2 towns over while my mom arranged for someone to come out and seal the crawl space permanently. Not with a latch this time, but with concrete poured over the opening entirely. A decision she made in about 30 seconds flat once the contractor asked whether we wanted it sealed or just repaired. Paige's mom called ours twice that week just to check in, and I overheard enough of one of those calls to know Paige had told her own parents at least part of what we'd seen out in the field 2 years before, though nobody in either house ever used the word that seemed to fit best. I stood in the yard and watched wet concrete get troweled smooth over the space where that door used to be, and something in my chest finally loosened for the first time in almost 2 weeks. The kind of relief that comes from watching a problem get physically buried rather than merely fixed. My mom didn't talk much on the drive back from my aunt's once it was done, and I didn't push her to. I noticed, though, that she'd started carrying my dad's old flashlight with her again, not just leaving it in the drawer, tucked into her coat pocket most days, whether she needed it or not. Like a person keeping a stone in their shoe on purpose so they wouldn't forget something they needed to remember. It was 3 days after the concrete had cured that I went out to the yard alone in the late afternoon, mostly just to sit somewhere that wasn't inside four walls for a little while, and noticed the ground near the edge of the new concrete slab had been disturbed. A shallow patch of dirt pushed up and loose in a rough circle, no bigger than a dinner plate, right where the old hatched door used to swing open. I crouched down and dug through the loose dirt with my fingers before I really thought about whether I should, telling myself even as I did it that whatever had made that mark was long gone now, sealed out for good, that digging here was no different than digging anywhere else in that yard. Near the bottom of that little disturbed patch, wrapped in a scrap of stiff weathered leather that had once been part of a work glove, was my dad's old pocket knife, the one with his initials scratched crookedly into the handle that he'd carried every single day of his life and that had never once been found after he died. I sat there in the grass with it in my open palm for a long time, the concrete drying pale and solid just a few feet away, and I didn't call for my mom right away. I just stared at those crooked initials, the same ones I used to trace with my thumb when I was small enough to sit in his lap while he whittled, and thought about how something had kept this for 3 years, right under our feet, waiting for exactly the right moment to give it back. I thought about the last thing I'd said to him, about not wanting to walk out into the dark with him that night, and for one strange, unsteady second, holding that knife, I felt almost forgiven, the way you feel when a door you thought was shut forever turns out to still have a little give in it. Then I thought about the patient way that shape had waited in the black opening of the hatch while the other one held my mom's ankle, unhurried, choosing its moment, and the feeling curdled into something much colder before I even made it back inside to tell her what I'd found. My brother Ethan died in a car accident, almost a year before any of this started. And about 2 months after the funeral, I asked my parents if I could move into his old room. Mine had always been the smaller one at the end of the hall, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser, and his had the better window and more closet space. But that isn't really why I asked. I asked because some nights I couldn't stand being 3 doors down from an empty room that still smelled faintly like him, and because some stupid part of me thought that sleeping where he used to sleep might feel like keeping a piece of him close, instead of shutting a door on it completely. My parents didn't argue. I think they were relieved someone was using that space again instead of letting it sit there like a museum exhibit nobody wanted to visit. Our house was an ordinary, 2-story place on a quiet street. Nothing special about it except maybe the age of it, old enough that the upstairs hallway had a slight slope you could feel in your knees if you walked it barefoot. My room, Ethan's old room, sat at the top of the stairs on the right, with the bathroom directly across the hall, and my parents' room further down past that. The window in my room faced the backyard, directly opposite the door, so that lying in bed you could look straight from one to the other without turning your head, which is a detail that matters more than it sounds like it should. My sister's room sat at the far end of the hall, past my parents', close enough to hear if something happened, but far enough that she rarely woke up for the ordinary creaks and settling sounds the rest of us had learned to sleep through. Ethan had kept his room fairly plain, just a bed, a desk piled with old textbooks he never got around to selling back, and a closet stuffed with clothes and boxes of things from years of school projects and old hobbies he'd mostly outgrown. My parents hadn't touched much of it in those first 2 months, and when I finally asked to move in, my mom spent a whole weekend helping me sort through what to keep and what to box up for storage, both of us crying more than either of us wanted to admit, folding his old shirts into totes we carried down to the garage together. The last thing I ever said to Ethan was something stupid about him borrowing my charger without asking, thrown at him as he left the house that night to pick up his girlfriend. And he'd laughed it off the way he always did and told me he'd bring me back food if I stopped being annoying about it. He never got the chance to bring anything back. A truck ran a red light on the way to her place, and that was that. I've replayed that stupid conversation about the charger more times than I can count, wishing I'd said literally anything else, anything that wasn't the last thing my brother ever heard from me. My parents told me, gently more than once in that first year, that he wouldn't have wanted me carrying that around, that he'd laughed it off exactly the way he laughed off everything, without a shred of real anger behind it. I believed them when they said it. Believing something and actually feeling it stop weighing on you turned out to be two very different things. For the first few weeks in his old room, nothing felt wrong exactly. Just different in ways I chalked up to grief doing what grief does, making ordinary things feel loaded with meaning they probably didn't have. I'd catch myself listening for his footsteps on the stairs some nights out of pure habit, and the silence where that sound used to be felt like its own kind of presence in the room. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a lot of things were normal that first year. Some mornings I'd wake up and forget for a few seconds whose room I was actually in, reaching for a light switch that was on the wrong side of the wall from where mine used to be. And that small disorientation felt like its own quiet ache every single time it happened. About a month into sleeping in that room, I started noticing a cold spot right by the closet door that never seemed to match the rest of the room's temperature, no matter what the thermostat said. I mentioned it once to my mom, and she said old houses had drafts like that, especially near closets built against exterior walls, and I let it go because it was an easy enough explanation to accept. Around the same time, the closet door itself started swinging slightly open on its own overnight, just an inch or two. Never enough to actually see inside, but always enough that I noticed it first thing every morning, even though I was sure I'd shut it firmly the night before. I started leaving a small stack of books against the base of it some nights, just to see if it would still manage to open. And more often than not, I'd wake to find the books pushed aside, never far, just enough to let the door creep back open that same inch or two. I mentioned the cold spot and the door to my dad, too, mostly in passing, and he ran his hand along the closet frame one weekend checking for a draft, found a small gap around the old window trim nearby, and caulked it shut, satisfied that he'd solved a perfectly ordinary problem. The cold spot was still there the next morning, exactly where it had always been, though I didn't tell him that. Some part of me had already stopped expecting these things to have tidy answers, even while I kept accepting the tidy answers out loud. We don't have any pets, never have. My parents were never dog or cat people. So when I started hearing faint scratching sounds some nights, coming from somewhere near the closet or the door, I had nothing obvious to blame it on. I told myself it was probably the house settling, or a branch from the tree outside brushing against the siding when the wind picked up, and for a while that explanation held up well enough to let me sleep. The sounds were never loud, never constant, just a few seconds here and there, easy to dismiss in the daylight, even if they weren't easy to ignore in the dark. My little sister, who was 12 that year and shared the bathroom across the hall from my room, mentioned to me once at breakfast that she'd heard something scratching on her own door a few nights before, and had assumed it was me messing with her the way I sometimes did. When I told her it wasn't me, she got quiet for a second, and then said maybe it had just been the wind. The same explanation I'd been giving myself, and neither of us pushed the conversation any further than that, though I noticed she started leaving her own door open a crack after that instead of shutting it all the way. A few weeks later, she asked, out of nowhere while we were doing dishes, whether I ever felt like someone was standing just behind the door before I opened it. And I told her yes, more than once, and neither of us said anything else about it that whole evening, both of us just quietly relieved and unsettled, in equal measure, to hear the other one say it out loud first. My mom, for her part, started doing something I only noticed months later, always finding some small reason to walk past my doorway last thing before she went to bed herself. A glass of water she needed to bring me. A light she wanted to check was off. Small errands that always happened to route her right past my door around midnight. I never called her out on it, and she never explained it, and I think we both understood it for exactly what it was without either of us having to say the word out loud. About 6 weeks in, I woke up one morning to find 3 faint, parallel scratches on the inside of the closet door, low down near the base, shallow enough that they might have been there for a while without me noticing, but deep enough that running my finger over them left no doubt they were real marks in the wood, not just scuffs from moving furniture. I showed my dad, and he crouched down, ran his thumb over them the same careful way he examined most things that confused him, and guessed it was probably from Ethan's old skateboard or some box that used to sit in there. Something ordinary that had left its mark years before any of us thought to look closely. I want to believe him. I mostly did during the day. The scratches on the closet door stayed exactly the same for weeks afterward. Not spreading, not fading, just sitting there low on the wood like something waiting to be matched up against a set that hadn't been made yet. I found myself checking them most mornings without really meaning to, running a finger along the grooves the way you'd check a scar to make sure it was still healed shut, and every single time they felt exactly as real and exactly as unexplained as the first day I'd found them. My dad had bought this house a few years before Ethan died, back when property near the good school district was still something we could afford, and it had always just been a normal home to us. Nothing with any history we knew of. No strange stories attached to it from before we moved in. That ordinariness was almost the worst part of it all. There was no old owner to blame, no bad history to point to. Just our own family and our own grief sitting inside 4 walls that had never given anyone trouble before we did. The night everything changed. I wasn't thinking about any of that. I woke up sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, my mouth dry, needing water and a trip to the bathroom, the ordinary reasons anyone wakes up in the middle of the night. The house was completely quiet in the particular way it only gets that deep into the night. No television murmuring downstairs, no cars passing on the street outside, just the low hum of the refrigerator carrying faintly up the stairwell. I got up, went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water without turning on more than the small light over the stove, used the bathroom across the hall on my way back, and climbed into bed feeling nothing more than the usual grogginess of being woken up out of a decent sleep. I remember closing my door behind me the way I always did, and lying down, already halfway back toward sleep, the mattress still warm, where I'd left it only minutes before. I'd barely settled into the mattress when I heard scratching against the inside of my bedroom door, slow and deliberate, 4 or 5 short scrapes, and then a pause, then more. My first thought, stupidly, was that it was my sister messing with me back for the joke I'd pulled on her the week before, except the sound was coming from too low down, closer to the floor than any hand would reach, and we didn't have a single pet in the house that could have made a sound like that. I lay frozen for a second, my heart suddenly slamming, and did something I've never told anyone the full truth about until now. I bit down on my own forearm, hard, testing whether I was actually awake, because I've never once felt real pain in a dream in my whole life, and I needed to know for certain which kind of night this was. It hurt exactly the way biting yourself is supposed to hurt, sharp and immediate, and that confirmation should have made me feel better, and instead made everything so much worse. I turned to face the window on the far side of the room, the one directly across from the door, and squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself if I just stayed still and quiet long enough, whatever was scratching would lose interest and stop. My whole body had gone rigid under the blanket, every muscle locked tight the way it does right before you're about to be hit by something you can't see coming. And some distant, useless part of my brain was still trying to talk me into believing it was a branch, a draft, anything ordinary at all. Instead, I heard my door swing open, not slammed, not creaking the slow way old doors usually do, just open all at once with a soft rush of air, and in the same instant I felt breath against my face, warm, far too warm for a room that had gone ice cold around me in the last few seconds, close enough that I could feel the individual push of it against my cheek and eyelids, like someone kneeling right beside the bed. It smelled faintly of something I couldn't place at first, and only later, lying awake replaying it, realized reminded me of the inside of Ethan's old car, a mix of stale fabric and something metallic underneath, though I've never let myself sit with that comparison for very long. I didn't open my eyes. I couldn't make myself do it. I lay there shaking, waiting for it to stop, and when it didn't, I made myself turn over, facing away from the door and toward the wall instead. Some instinctive animal idea that not looking at whatever it was might make it lose track of me. The breathing followed. It shouldn't have been able to follow a turn like that, not without me hearing footsteps or feeling weight shift on the mattress. But it was right there again within a second or two. Warm against the back of my neck now instead of my face. Patient in a way that made my skin crawl worse than any sudden movement could have. It went on like that for what felt like 5 full minutes, though I have no real way of knowing how long it actually was, lying there rigid with my eyes shut, feeling that warm, steady breath moving between my face and the back of my neck, depending on which way I turned, like it was testing which direction I'd try next, and simply following along without effort. I prayed silently. To anyone who might have been listening, including stupidly, to my brother, asking him if he could hear me, asking him to make it stop if there was any way at all that he could. Some tiny, awful part of me almost hoped, for half a second, that the warmth against my skin was somehow him, that grief could bend far enough to explain something like this, before the rest of me recoiled hard from that thought, certain, in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone, that whatever this was had nothing gentle in it at all. It stopped all at once, the warmth gone so suddenly that the cold of the room rushed back in to fill the space where it had been, and I lay there afterward, not daring to move, counting my own heartbeat in my ears, waiting for some sign it was safe to look. I don't know how long I waited after that, long enough that my arm had gone numb underneath me before I finally forced my eyes open. My whole body had started shaking by then, in a way I couldn't control, teeth chattering slightly, even though the worst of the cold had already passed. Adrenaline finally catching up with everything my mind had been holding at bay. There was nothing by the door anymore, no shape, no shadow, just the dark rectangle of the hallway beyond it, faintly lit by the nightlight my parents kept plugged in downstairs. I turned my head toward the window instead, some instinct pulling my attention that way, even though nothing there should have been able to make a sound. And that's when I saw it, a shape standing just outside the glass, backlit faintly by the porch light on the neighbor's fence line beyond our yard, its head tilted hard to one side, at an angle that made my stomach drop. The way an animal tilts its head, it's something curious about. Except no human neck bends that far without breaking. The instant our eyes met, or whatever passed for eyes on that shape, its mouth stretched open wider than should have been possible, and it screamed, except the sound didn't come until a full second after the mouth had already snapped shut again, arriving late and wrong, like watching a video with the audio dragging half a beat behind the picture. I have never heard anything like that sound before or since, and I hope I never do again. It wasn't loud so much as it was wrong, pitched somewhere between a scream and a screech. The kind of sound that seemed to land directly behind my eyes instead of in my ears, and for one disoriented second. I honestly couldn't have told you whether the house around me was still standing the same way it had been a moment before. I slammed my eyes shut and curled into myself, pulling my knees up against my chest, some useless childhood instinct that being smaller and tighter might make me a harder target. I felt something close around my forearm, almost immediately after. Not a scratch first, but a grip. Fingers, if they were fingers, wrapping most of the way around my arm with a pressure that didn't feel like it belonged to hands built the normal way, and I felt myself being pulled, just slightly, toward the edge of the bed, toward the window, my whole body sliding an inch or two across the sheets before I found enough voice to scream. My dad was in the room within seconds, the hallway light flooding in behind him, and I heard him shout something, more startled sound than actual words, and the grip on my arm tore free all at once, nails or claws dragging hard across my skin as it let go. And by the time I finally opened my eyes again, gasping, my dad was standing over me, with the room lamp now on too, and there was nothing at the window at all, just the ordinary dark yard and the neighbor's fence light, glowing steady the way it always did. He told me later he'd heard the scream from clear down the hall through two closed doors, loud enough that he was already moving before he was fully awake, and that by the time he reached my doorway, he thought for one terrible second he was going to find me, the way I'd found news about Ethan, and he's never quite been able to finish that sentence in front of me since. My dad checked the window latch first, out of pure instinct, and found it locked exactly the way it should have been, no sign of it having been open from either side. He checked the closet next, flipping on the light and pushing coats aside, finding nothing but the usual mess of old clothes and boxes. My mom came in soon after, and between the two of them, they spent almost 20 minutes going through my room and the hallway, and even downstairs, checking every door and window in the house, finding nothing out of place except me, shaking, refusing to let go of my dad's arm, and the 3 fresh cuts nobody had noticed yet in the chaos of the first few minutes. It wasn't until my mom turned the lamp closer to actually look me over that anyone noticed the blood. 3 parallel scratches ran down my forearm from wrist almost to elbow, deep enough that a couple of them had already crusted over in places and were still weeping in others, spaced too evenly to have come from my own fingernails, no matter how hard I might have dug into my own skin in a panic. My mom went pale looking at them, glancing once toward the closet door where the older, fainter set of scratches from weeks before were still visible in the wood, low near the base, at almost exactly the height a hand reaching up from a crouch would leave them. They cleaned the cuts and bandaged them that night without much conversation, the kind of quiet that happens when nobody wants to say the thing everyone's thinking. My dad ended up sitting in the hallway outside my door in an old kitchen chair for the rest of that night, not saying he believed anything strange had happened, just saying he'd feel better keeping an eye on things until it got light out, and none of us argued with that arrangement. My sister appeared in the doorway at some point, too, wrapped in a blanket, and nobody sent her back to her own room. The four of us ending up spread out through the hallway and my doorway until the sky outside finally started to lighten. Nobody saying much of anything, just needing to be near each other. In the morning, once there was enough daylight to make the whole thing feel slightly less possible, my dad went over every inch of the window frame again with a flashlight, checking the exterior this time from a ladder against the siding, and found nothing. No marks, no disturbed dirt in the flower bed below, no sign anything had climbed up to that second-story window at all. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made the whole night feel even less like something I could explain away, since whatever had been at that glass clearly hadn't needed a ladder to get there. The scratches took almost 2 weeks to heal into faint pink lines, and even longer than that before I could sleep with the lights fully off again. For a long while after, I slept with my closet door taped shut with painter's tape, my dad put up without either of us discussing why, and with the hallway light left on every single night, something my parents never once complained about the electric bill for. My sister started sleeping with her own door propped open with a shoe for months afterward, and neither of my parents ever asked her to stop, the whole house rearranging itself quietly, around a fear none of us fully said out loud. I talked to a couple of friends about it eventually, careful with how much I told them, and the ones who'd had any kind of unexplainable experience themselves mostly suggested sleep paralysis, said it explained the pressure and the fear and even sometimes the sense of a presence in the room. I told them I understood why they'd think that, but that I'd tested for exactly that possibility myself in the moment, that I'd been able to move, to turn over, to bite down hard enough to leave a mark, all things people describe being unable to do during actual sleep paralysis. None of them had a better answer after that, and neither did I. One friend, who'd never had anything strange happen to her at all, just went quiet for a while after I finished telling it, and then asked, carefully, whether I thought it had anything to do with Ethan, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, and that some nights I hoped it did, and other nights that was the worst possibility of all. It was almost a month later, going through some of my brother's old things with my mom, boxes we'd finally worked up the nerve to start sorting through, that I came across the folder of paperwork from after the accident, insurance forms and a copy of the police report my parents had kept filed away without ever really discussing its contents with me. I only meant to glance at it, checking for an old photo I remembered him keeping tucked inside, and my eyes caught on the listed time of the collision before I could stop myself from reading it. 2:47 in the morning. I sat there holding that page for a long time, my mom asking from across the room what was wrong, and I couldn't find a way to explain to her that the exact stretch of time I now spent every single night lying rigid and wide awake, refusing to so much as glance at a clock, refusing to get up for water or the bathroom no matter how badly I needed either, was the same narrow window of time my brother had died in, and that the night it all happened in my room had landed only a handful of days from the 1-year anniversary of that very accident. I did the math without wanting to, sitting there with the report still in my hands. Exams had eaten up most of that week, and I hadn't consciously registered the calendar at all in the days leading up to that night, too buried in studying to notice how close we'd come to the anniversary, until I saw the date typed plainly on that old report. I hadn't noticed the connection before, hadn't let myself look for one, because looking for a pattern meant admitting there was something to find. My mom eventually came over and took the folder gently out of my hands, the same way she'd taken things out of my hands as a kid when I was upset, and neither of us said anything about the date out loud, though I saw her eyes catch on it too before she closed the folder, and set it back in the box. I still live in that room. I never asked to move back to my old one, partly out of stubbornness, and partly, I think, because some part of me is afraid that whatever happened would simply follow the room rather than stay behind in it. And I'd rather know exactly where it lives than wonder if I've carried it somewhere new. The scratches on the closet door are still there, low near the base, right where they've always been. And some mornings I still find myself checking them, running a finger along the grooves, the way you'd check an old wound to be sure it hasn't reopened. It never has. Not yet. I grew up in a house at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded on three sides by dense woods, close enough to the nearest town that we could get there in 20 minutes, but far enough that it never felt like we actually belonged to it. My dad died in a logging accident when I was 5, something I barely remember except in scattered pieces, the sound of my mom crying behind a closed door. A casserole dish someone left on our porch that nobody ever picked back up. After that, it was just the two of us out there. My mom working 2 jobs to keep the house, and me growing up mostly alone in the woods behind our property, learning early on that help, if it ever came, would take a long time getting to us, and that the two of us were, in every real sense, on our own, out there. My mom never talked much about my dad after the first year or two, though I'd sometimes catch her standing at the kitchen window in the evenings, looking out at the tree line the way you look at something you're waiting for, even after you've stopped expecting it to actually arrive. She kept his old hunting rifle in the front closet, unloaded, more out of habit than any real plan to use it. And she was the kind of careful that only comes from having already learned once that terrible things could happen to the people you loved without any warning at all. Our nearest neighbors were an older couple who lived about a quarter-mile down the road, past a bend thick with pine trees that blocked any view between our 2 properties. We waved to them sometimes when our cars passed on the gravel, and my mom would occasionally chat with the wife at the mailbox. But we weren't the kind of neighbors who visited each other's houses or called on the phone just to talk. Almost nobody came to our door unannounced, which is part of why what happened felt so wrong from the very first knock. Looking back, there were small things in the weeks before that first night that none of us thought much of at the time. My mom mentioned once, getting the mail, that she thought she'd seen someone standing at the edge of the trees near our driveway just as it was getting dark, gone by the time she looked again, and she decided it must have been a deer or a trick of the fading light. Our neighbor's old hound started barking some evenings around dusk in a way it hadn't before, a sharp, unsettled kind of barking that carried faintly through the trees from a quarter-mile off, and my mom mentioned that too, only in passing, guessing the dog had probably just found a raccoon. Our house was a simple 2-story place, kitchen and living room downstairs, 2 bedrooms and a narrow hallway upstairs, with a staircase that came down almost directly across from the front door. That front door had a small brass peephole set into it at adult height, something my dad had installed years before he died, back when he still worried about the kind of things fathers worry about for houses at the end of long, empty roads. I was 9 years old the night it started, home alone with my mom on a weeknight in early winter, both of us already upstairs getting ready for bed. The pounding began without any warning at all. No car engine we'd heard pull up, no dog barking a warning the way our neighbor's old hounds sometimes did when something moved through the woods between our properties. It was just suddenly there, loud enough that the whole downstairs seemed to shake with it, fists slamming against solid wood in a rhythm that never let up for even a second to draw breath. My mom went very still for a moment at the top of the stairs, then told me to stay exactly where I was, and went down to look through the peephole. I remember standing at the top of those stairs, gripping the railing, watching her small shape cross the dark living room below me, watching her lean close to that little brass circle in the door for what felt like a very long time. When she came back up, her face had gone a shade of pale I'd never seen on her before. And instead of answering any of my questions, she picked up the phone in her bedroom and called the police first, her voice low and controlled in a way that scared me more than the pounding downstairs did. Only after she'd hung up did she crouch down to my level and tell me it was one of our neighbors outside, the husband from the couple down the road, and that everything was going to be fine. I asked her, the way any 9-year-old would, why she didn't just go talk to him if she knew who it was, why we couldn't just open the door and ask what he needed. She told me to be quiet and stay close to her instead of answering, and something about the way she avoided the question told me, even at that age, that there was more to it than she was willing to say out loud, and that whatever she'd seen through that little brass circle in the door was something she'd already decided I was too young to carry alongside her. The pounding continued for what felt like forever, though my mom told me years later it had actually been about 10 more minutes. An impossibly long stretch of solid noise from a man who apparently never paused to knock politely or call out a single word the whole time. Then, all at once, it simply stopped. The silence afterward somehow louder than the pounding had been. Both of us sitting frozen on the top step, straining to hear footsteps, a car, anything that would tell us whether he'd actually left. The police took a long while to arrive, longer than felt right, given how urgent my mom's voice had sounded on the phone. And by the time their headlights finally swept across our living room windows, there was no sign of anyone outside at all. I remember pressing my face against my bedroom window upstairs while we waited, watching the empty gravel driveway below, half expecting to see him standing there in the dark even after the pounding had stopped, and feeling somehow worse for not being able to see anything at all than I think I would have felt actually seeing him. My mom went down and spoke with the 2 officers on our porch while I watched from the top of the stairs, catching only pieces of the conversation. Words like disturbance and no one on scene and we'll follow up in the morning. They left without ever going door to door in the woods around us, without ever explaining to me directly what exactly had been happening on the other side of that door while I stood frozen at the top of the stairs. It was a long time before I learned the rest of it, pieced together slowly over years from overheard conversations and careful half-answers whenever I finally asked directly. The man outside our door that night had been our neighbor from down the road, and he had been standing there completely naked in the freezing cold, holding a long-handled axe loosely at his side the entire time he pounded on our door with his bare fist. My mom had seen all of that clearly through the peephole, every second of it, and had made the decision in that instant not to say a single word to me until the police were already on their way. That first night turned out to be only the beginning. Over the following weeks, he came back several more times, always late at night, always pounding on that same door in that same relentless, wordless way, though never again with the axe. My mom started keeping a heavy kitchen chair wedged under the door handle every single night after that first visit, a habit she kept up long after the police had supposedly spoken to his family about it. She also started sleeping with the hallway light on and her bedroom door propped open, so she'd hear me if I so much as turned over in bed, something she'd never done before that winter and never really stopped doing afterward, even years later, long after there was any reason left to worry. One afternoon, in broad daylight, I actually saw him myself through our front window, fully clothed that time, standing at the edge of our gravel driveway, with an expression on his face that has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else from that whole stretch of my childhood. A kind of slack, wandering confusion, like a man who'd woken up somewhere he didn't recognize and couldn't quite work out how he'd gotten there. My mom eventually learned, through the kind of slow rural grapevine that passes information between houses that never actually visit each other, that he had a growing tumor pressing on part of his brain. Something that had been quietly changing his behavior for months before anyone outside his own house understood what was happening. His wife, when the police first went to speak with her, insisted he was harmless, just confused, and that she could manage him herself without any further involvement. It took several more months, and I think at least one more visit to our door in the middle of the night before he finally got the surgery and the treatment he needed. My mom used to say afterward that she didn't blame the wife for any of it, that she couldn't imagine how impossible a decision it must have been to call for help against your own husband. A man who by every account had been gentle and unremarkable his whole life before whatever was growing in his head started rewriting the rest of him. By the following spring, the pounding had stopped completely, and the man himself, once his treatment had taken hold, turned out to be about as gentle and apologetic a person as you could imagine. He came to our door himself one afternoon, fully dressed, moving carefully like someone still recovering, holding a plate of muffins his wife had baked, and stood on our porch apologizing to my mom for what he called his behavior during his bad spell. A term that felt almost absurdly small for what those nights had actually been like from the other side of that door. My mom accepted the muffins graciously, and the two of them talked for a while in a tone so ordinary it was hard to reconcile with the memory of him standing naked in our driveway with an axe. I watched the whole exchange from the front window, close enough to see his hands trembling slightly around the edges of that plate. And some part of me, even as a kid, understood that he was more afraid of us in that moment than we had any real reason left to be of him. Knowing all of that, knowing exactly how it ended, and exactly how harmless he really turned out to be, did almost nothing to change the shape the fear had already carved into me. For years afterward, I had the same recurring nightmare. Someone pounding relentlessly on a door somewhere, in a house that was always slightly different from our real one. Me fumbling desperately with a lock that wouldn't turn fast enough, watching the door begin to give at the hinges no matter how hard I threw my whole small body against it. I grew out of telling anyone about that particular nightmare long before I grew out of having it. 7 years later, when I was 16, I started babysitting regularly for my older brother's 4 boys, all of them under 10, on the nights he and his wife needed a night out or had to work late. Their house sat at the edge of a newer development, backed up against a stretch of undeveloped woods, much smaller than the ones I'd grown up surrounded by. Though on quiet nights, you could still hear the same kind of rustling and settling sounds drifting in from the tree line. I liked babysitting for them. Mostly the boys were loud and chaotic in a way that filled up a house, so different from the quiet my mom and I had lived inside for so many years, and some nights I think I looked forward to it more for the noise than for the money. The house itself was ordinary and comfortable. An open living room connected to the kitchen, a staircase leading up to 4 small bedrooms where the boys slept, and out front, an enclosed porch that my brother had put in himself a couple of years earlier, meant mostly as a mudroom and a spot to take his boots off before coming inside. That enclosed porch was separated from the actual living room by a flimsy interior door, mostly wood with a single large glass pane set into the top half, covered on the inside by a thin, sheer curtain, more decorative than functional. The porch's own exterior door, leading out to the front steps and the driveway, had a lock on it, too. Though it was the kind of afterthought lock nobody in the family thought much about, since the porch itself never held anything worth stealing, just a row of muddy boots and a couple of bikes leaned up against the wall for winter storage. On the night everything happened, I'd gotten all 4 boys down for the night by around 9. The 2 younger ones asleep almost immediately, and the 2 older boys reading with flashlights under their blankets a while longer, before finally going quiet too. My brother and his wife had left around 7 for a late dinner in town to celebrate his birthday, promising to be back before midnight, and I remember texting my mom around 10 just to let her know things were quiet. A habit I'd kept up on babysitting nights since the very first time she'd asked me if I felt safe there alone with the boys. I settled onto the living room couch afterward, close enough to that inner porch door to hear anything that happened on the front steps, and drifted into the kind of light, half-aware sleep you get into when you're technically on duty, even while resting. I woke a little after 2 in the morning to the sound of the porch's outer door creaking open, followed almost immediately by heavy, uneven footsteps crossing the enclosed porch itself, meaning whoever it was had already made it past the first door before I even registered anything was wrong. My brother, it turned out later, had forgotten to lock that outer door before he left for work that afternoon, something none of us realized until it was already far too late to matter. For one disoriented second, still half asleep, I actually thought it might be my brother himself coming home early, fumbling with his keys, and I almost called out his name before the wrongness of the footsteps. Too heavy, too stumbling, made the words die in my throat instead. Whoever was out there started pounding on the inner door almost immediately. That same flimsy wood and glass barrier separating the porch from the living room, where I now sat bolt upright on the couch, heart already slamming. Through the thin sheer curtain, I could make out the vague, distorted shape of a man, big through the shoulders, swaying slightly on his feet in a way that made my stomach drop even before I could smell the alcohol coming off him through the gap under the door. For half a second, watching that shape lurch closer to the glass, I thought absurdly of the old nightmare I used to have as a kid. Someone pounding on a door I couldn't quite get locked in time, and then the thought vanished completely, replaced by the very real, very present fact of 4 sleeping children directly above my head. He could see me too, or at least see my shape sitting frozen on the couch, and the second our eyes met through that flimsy curtain, he started talking, loud and slurring, demanding to be let inside so he could talk to someone named Greg. I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that he had the wrong house, that there was no Greg here, that he needed to leave right now. He didn't leave. He kept demanding it, kept insisting he knew for a fact that Greg lived here, his voice rising with a kind of drunk, stubborn certainty that made it clear facts weren't going to be the thing that moved him, repeating the name again and again like it was the only word left he trusted himself to say clearly. I stood up from the couch on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own and moved toward the door, close enough to see his silhouette shift and lean in against the glass from the other side, close enough to hear his breathing turn ragged and impatient. The porch light behind him threw his shadow huge and warped across the sheer curtain, one massive arm rising to slam against the frame again before I'd even finished telling him to leave, and I remember thinking, absurdly, in the middle of all that fear, that the curtain my sister-in-law had picked out for that door had never once seemed flimsy to me before that exact moment. I told him again, louder this time, that he needed to leave, that there were kids sleeping upstairs, hoping that fact alone might shame him into backing off. Instead, his fist came down hard on the wood frame beside the glass, hard enough that the whole door shuddered in its hinges, hard enough that one of the older boys called out sleepily from upstairs, asking what that noise was. For one endless second, I stood frozen exactly the way I'd been frozen at the top of our old staircase at 9 years old, watching my mom lean into that peephole, waiting to be told what was happening on the other side of a door I couldn't see through myself. Then the man outside slammed his fist against the door again, this time square against the glass pane itself, and I heard it crack, a spiderweb of fracture lines spreading out from the point of impact, the sheer curtain suddenly sagging inward where the glass behind it had shifted. I grabbed the heavy wooden chair from beside the coat rack and jammed it under the door handle exactly the way my mom used to jam a kitchen chair under our own front door years before, bracing my shoulder against the door itself as an extra measure, my whole body shaking with an adrenaline that felt disturbingly familiar. He hit the door again, and this time his hand came through the cracked pane entirely, fingers groping blindly through the gap in the glass for the doorknob or the lock, close enough that I could see the torn skin along his knuckles from the broken edges, close enough that I had to slam my own palm against the chair to keep it from sliding loose under the pressure. His fingers brushed the back of my hand where it rested against the chair, just for an instant, cold and slick with what I realized afterward must have been his own blood, and I yanked my hand back so fast I nearly lost my grip on the chair entirely. I shouted at him then, everything I had left in me, that I was calling the police right now, that he needed to leave immediately, my voice cracking in a way that embarrassed me even in the moment. His hand withdrew from the broken gap almost as suddenly as it had appeared, and for a few seconds there was nothing but his ragged breathing on the other side of the door and my own heart slamming loud enough that I could hear it in my ears. Upstairs, I heard one of the younger boys start crying, woken fully now by the noise, and the older boy's footsteps moving toward the top of the stairs before I managed to call up sharply for him to stay exactly where he was. The pounding started up again after that, less rhythmic now, more like someone throwing their whole weight against the frame in frustration rather than any organized attempt to break through, and it went on like that for several more agonizing minutes, the chair under the handle groaning with each impact, but somehow holding. I kept one hand pressed against the phone in my pocket the entire time, too afraid to actually dial and take my attention off the door even for the few seconds it would take, terrified that the moment I looked away would be the moment the chair finally gave. Behind me, I could hear the older boy still standing frozen at the top of the stairs despite what I'd told him, and I forced my voice into something steadier than I felt to tell him again to get his brothers into the back bedroom and shut the door. Some part of my brain already running through what I'd do if that chair actually failed, which door I'd get the boys through, how far the neighbor's porch light was, and whether we could make it there faster than he could catch up. As suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. I heard him mutter something under his breath I couldn't make out, followed by the heavy, uneven sound of his footsteps retreating back across the porch. The outer door creaking open and then banging shut behind him hard enough that I felt it through the floor. I stayed exactly where I was for a long time after that, one hand still braced against the chair, not trusting the silence any more than I'd trusted the noise, half convinced he might circle back around and try one of the other doors instead. Only once I'd counted a full 5 minutes of nothing but the ordinary hum of the refrigerator did I finally let my hand drop away from that chair. When I finally worked up the nerve to call the police, my hands were shaking badly enough that I fumbled the number twice before getting it right. They arrived about 20 minutes later, walked the property with flashlights, found nothing and no one, and took my statement standing in the wreckage of that cracked glass pane, the sheer curtain now hanging half-torn from its little rod. One of the officers found a smear of blood on the doorframe where the man's torn knuckles had dragged against the wood reaching for the lock, and photographed it along with a spiderwebbed crack in the glass, real physical proof of something that otherwise would have felt too much like my own old nightmare come back to life for anyone to fully believe. One of the younger officers asked me a few times, gently, whether I was sure I hadn't recognized the man's voice or his build from anywhere, whether there was any chance at all this was someone connected to the family rather than a total stranger. And each time I told him no, that I'd never heard that voice before in my life. that I had absolutely no idea who Greg was supposed to be, or why this particular house, out of every house on that quiet street, was the one he'd chosen to come pounding on that night. He wrote it all down without much visible reaction, the kind of practiced calm that made me wonder how many nights, just like this one, he'd already walked through before mine. My brother came home early once I called him, pale and furious and apologizing over and over for the unlocked door, and between the two of us, we managed to calm all four boys back down and get them settled again before their parents had even planned on being home for the night. Nobody ever identified the man who'd been pounding on that door, and nobody ever figured out who Greg was supposed to be, or whether such a person had ever actually lived in that house at any point before my brother bought it. The police report noted an unknown male, intoxicated, no further leads, and that was the last any of us ever heard about it. I still think, more often than I'd like to admit, about the strange symmetry of it all. A man pounding relentlessly on a door between me and everything I was responsible for protecting. Twice now, in one lifetime. 7 years and 100 miles apart, with no more explanation the second time than the first. My brother replaced that porch door within the week. Solid wood this time, with a proper deadbolt and no glass anywhere in it at all, and I've never once slept on that couch again without checking that lock myself first, no matter how many times someone else swears they've already done it. No matter how many years pass between one night like that and the next. My mom, when I finally told her the whole story a few days later, went quiet for a long moment on the phone before saying, in a voice I didn't fully understand until years afterward, that some houses just seemed to attract that kind of night, and that she was sorry, in a way she couldn't fully explain, that I'd ever had to learn what that felt like a second time. I asked her what she meant by that, whether she thought there was some reason it kept happening to us specifically. And she only said that she didn't know, that some things in this life never do come with a reason attached, no matter how badly you want one. She was quiet again for a moment, and then added, almost to herself, that she'd always wondered whether places just remembered certain kinds of fear, whether a door that had once shaken under a stranger's fists somehow carried that shaking forward into the next one, in the next house, on the next person standing behind it. Neither of us has ever found out who Greg was, or whether he ever existed at all, or what became of the man who stood outside that porch door with his fist bleeding through a curtain, insisting he knew exactly which house he was supposed to be standing in front of. My mom has a story she tells about our house that happened years before I was even born, back when my two older brothers were still small, a story I must have heard 100 times over the years at family dinners, birthdays, and long car rides, always told the exact same way. Right down to the same pause before the part about the archway. Callum was 4, and Sean was barely walking, and my dad was at work at the convenience store he managed on the edge of town. My mum was in the boys' bedroom that afternoon, trying to settle them down after they'd worked themselves into one of those wild fits of giggling that little kids get, when she heard something heavy thumping around in the living room, one solid impact after another, close together, like someone dropping furniture. She left the boys and went to look, and found the big framed painting that used to hang above our living room sofa. A fairly ordinary picture of an old sailing ship cutting through gray water, lying against the wall on the opposite side of the house entirely. My mom always said the painting hadn't been anything special to look at, just something my dad's own mother had passed along to them when they first bought the house, hung above the sofa, mostly because the wall looked too bare without it rather than out of any real fondness for the thing itself. To get there, it would have had to come off its hook, cross the whole width of the living room, pass clean through the open archway into our dining room, and somehow land propped upright against the far dining room wall, facing back the way it had come, without a single scratch or dent anywhere on the frame. My mum used to say the strangest part wasn't even the distance the thing had traveled, but the fact that it had come to rest standing perfectly upright, leaning at just the right angle against the wall, the way you'd carefully prop a picture up yourself rather than the way anything falls or gets thrown. My mum called my dad at work that same afternoon and told him to get rid of it the moment he came home, and he did, though neither of them ever really talked about what they thought had actually happened to make a heavy painting travel that far without falling flat or shattering. That story became a kind of family joke for years. Something brought up at dinner when the conversation turned to strange coincidences, and I never thought much of it myself until the year everything else started happening. The year I turned 15 and my great-grandmother died. Growing up, I heard that painting story so many times it had almost worn smooth around the edges, the way family stories do after enough retellings, funny rather than frightening, something my dad liked to bring up whenever a picture frame hung slightly crooked on the wall. Our house itself never struck me as strange in any other way during those years. It was a plain two-story place with a living room and dining room joined by that same wide archway, a kitchen at the back, and bedrooms upstairs for me and my two brothers. Ordinary in every visible respect, the kind of house nobody driving past would look at twice, the kind of house real estate agents describe as full of character, without ever quite meaning it the way we came to understand the phrase. We called her Nana Iris, and she lived about 20 minutes from us in a small bungalow stuffed full of finished and half-finished sewing projects. Quilts and cardigans and christening blankets she'd made for every single one of her great-grandchildren over the decades, each one stitched with the same tight, careful hand she'd apparently had since she was a girl. I used to spend afternoons at her place after school some weeks, mostly just sitting with her while she worked the fabric through her machine or hand-stitched something in her lap, half listening to stories about people I'd never met, half doing my homework at her kitchen table. Her sewing room smelled a particular way I could still identify blind to this day, thread and starch and the faint scorched cotton smell of an iron pressed a little too long against fabric, mixed in with the wintergreen rub she used on her hands some evenings when her arthritis flared up from all those hours of stitching. A few months before she died, she gave me a quilt she'd been working on for close to a year, made specifically for me, heavier and more detailed than any of the ones she'd made for my brothers or cousins, with a border pattern she told me she'd designed herself and never used before. I was 15 and embarrassed in a way I'm still not proud of. Worried what my friends would think if they saw an old-fashioned handmade quilt on my bed instead of the plain duvet cover everyone else my age seemed to have. I thanked her quickly, folded it up, and put it away in the bottom of my closet the same afternoon. And I don't think I ever properly told her how much work I understood had gone into it, or how much it actually meant that she'd made something just for me. I remember the exact moment she handed it over, sitting in her cluttered front room with the afternoon light coming in low through the curtains, her hands trembling slightly the way they'd started to that last year, folding back the tissue paper she'd wrapped it in like she was unveiling something far grander than an old woman's blanket. She told me she'd started that particular border pattern 3 different times before finally getting the tension right, unpicking whole rows of stitches rather than settle for something less than exactly what she'd pictured for me. I nodded along and said thank you and asked within about 2 minutes whether I could go meet my friends at the shops, and she smiled and told me to go on. The same patient smile she gave me for most things, and I never once stopped to think that might be one of the last real conversations we'd have. She died a few months after that, quietly in her sleep, and I remember standing at the funeral wishing more than anything that I'd unfolded that quilt in front of her even once, just to let her see it on my bed the way it was supposed to be seen. For the first few weeks after the funeral, our house felt exactly the way houses feel after a death in the family. Quiet and a little too careful, everyone tiptoeing gently around each other's grief without quite knowing what to say. Then, gradually, small things started happening that none of us could easily explain, and looking back now, I think they'd actually started almost immediately. Only we were too distracted by our own mourning at first to notice how strange they really were. The first thing I really paid attention to was our old family computer, kept in the corner of the living room for anyone in the house to use, which started turning itself on at odd hours. The monitor glowing to life in an empty room in the middle of the night, or the fan spinning up loud enough to wake whoever was sleeping closest to that side of the house. My dad checked the wiring twice, found nothing wrong with it, and blamed a faulty power switch that never actually failed again, no matter how many times he tested it afterward. Once, sitting right in front of it doing homework with nobody else anywhere near the desk, I watched the screen flicker awake on its own from standby, the little hard drive light blinking steadily as though someone had just pressed the button themselves. And I sat there, frozen for a long moment before I finally reached over and shut it back down myself, my hand not quite steady on the switch. Around the same time, my eldest brother Callum, who by then was well into his 20s and still living at home while he saved up for his own place, started waking up some mornings to find his blankets pulled tightly up over his head while he slept, tucked in so snugly around his shoulders that he said it took real effort to get his arms free, despite living alone in his room with the door shut every single night. He mentioned it at breakfast one morning, half joking, asking if anyone had been sneaking in to mess with him, and got nothing but blank looks from the rest of us, since nobody else in the house had been anywhere near his room. He started leaving his door slightly open after that, saying he'd rather deal with the draft than wake up feeling like he'd been tucked in by someone he couldn't see. I started feeling something too, though it took me longer to say anything about it, partly because it happened in that hazy space between waking and sleeping where you can never quite trust your own memory of the sensation afterward. Some nights, lying in bed, I'd feel an arm settle across my waist from behind, gentle at first, almost comforting in a strange way, gone completely the moment I managed to force my eyes open and look around the empty room. I told myself for a long while that it was just the particular loneliness of missing someone, my mind conjuring up the memory of being held or comforted during a hard year. And for a while, that explanation felt like enough to let me fall back asleep afterward. It reminded me more than anything of the way Nana Iris used to rest her hand briefly on my shoulder whenever she leaned over to check my stitching. Light and quick, and gone again almost before I noticed it. And some nights that similarity was the only thing that let me close my eyes again instead of lying awake until morning. My dad, meanwhile, had started noticing things at the convenience store he managed. Things that had nothing, obviously, to do with our house at all, though he'd bring them home and mention them over dinner with a kind of nervous half-laugh that made it clear he didn't quite believe his own explanations either. The plastic lids on the slushy machine would flick themselves out of their holders during quiet stretches of his shift, clattering onto the counter with no one anywhere near them. His own car, parked out in the lot during his lunch break, would flash its headlights on and off a few times, with the engine cold and the keys still in his pocket. Once, on a slow evening with the store completely empty, the automatic front doors slid open and shut twice in a row, with nobody standing anywhere near the sensor, and he told us he'd stood there afterward with the hair standing up on his arms, waiting for a customer to walk in and explain it. And nobody ever did. He started parking his car closer to the front windows after that, he admitted once, sheepishly, just so he could keep an eye on it through his shift. None of us said the word out loud yet, not really, though I think all four of us were quietly starting to link it back to Nana Iris in our own private way. The same way you'll notice a certain smell or a certain song and think of someone without meaning to. My mum started leaving a small framed photo of her on the mantel that hadn't been there before, and I noticed her talking to it sometimes in the mornings while she made coffee. Quiet. One-sided conversations I pretended not to overhear. My dad started bringing home little offhand comments about the store, almost like confessions, testing the water each time to see whether the rest of us would laugh him off or take it seriously, and each time we took it a little more seriously than the time before. It was around the 2-month mark after the funeral that I finally took the quilt out of my closet and put it properly on my bed, partly because the guilt of leaving it folded up in the dark had started to outweigh whatever embarrassment I'd felt about it as a 15-year-old. I remember unfolding it carefully across my mattress that evening, running my hand over the tight. Careful stitching along that border pattern she'd told me she'd invented just for me, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been knotted up tight since the funeral. I sat with it for a while that night, the way I used to sit with her in that sewing room, tracing the pattern with one finger, the same slow way she used to trace fabric before she cut it. And for the first time since she died, I let myself cry properly about it, instead of just carrying the tight, careful sadness around all day like I had been. That was the same week. Everything got noticeably worse. The arm around my waist stopped being a hazy half-dream and started feeling entirely real. Present enough some nights that I'd wake fully alert with my heart already racing. Absolutely certain someone had just been lying behind me in that bed a half second before I opened my eyes. The air in my room would carry a faint smell some nights that I couldn't place at first. Something like the inside of Nana Iris's sewing room, thread and old fabric, and the particular scorched cotton smell of an iron pressed a little too long against cloth. I mentioned that smell to my mum once, carefully, and she went quiet for a moment before admitting she'd caught the same thing drifting through the hallway some evenings, right around the time she usually put the kettle on for tea. I started hearing something too, faint at first, easy to dismiss as the house settling, or a neighbor's television bleeding through the wall. A soft, rhythmic sound that took me weeks to properly identify as the sound of an old foot-pedal sewing machine running somewhere close by. That particular clatter, and where Nana Iris's machine used to make in her sewing room every single afternoon I'd spent there. There was no sewing machine anywhere in our house. There never had been. I used to lie there some nights with my eyes shut, listening to that faint clatter rise and fall, telling myself it would stop the moment I really focused on it. And some nights it did. And some nights it just kept going steadily until I finally fell back asleep despite it. One night, about 3 weeks after I'd put the quilt back on my bed, I woke to that same arm settling across my waist. Except this time, it didn't stay gentle. The room had gone noticeably colder than it should have been for the season. Cold enough that I could feel it against the bare skin of my arms, even through the quilt. And underneath that cold was the same scorched cotton smell from Nana Iris's sewing room. Stronger now than I'd ever caught it before. Thick enough to catch in the back of my throat. The grip tightened all at once, hard enough that I felt real pressure against my ribs. And instead of the vague comfort I'd half convinced myself I was imagining before, I felt myself being pulled backward across the mattress, toward the edge of the bed nearest my closet, with a strength that made it immediately, unmistakably clear this was not a dream and not a memory playing tricks on a grieving mind. I grabbed the headboard with both hands and held on as hard as I could, my whole body twisting against a pull that felt less like a hug now and more like something trying to drag me bodily out of that bed, the quilt itself bunching and dragging along with me across the sheets. I could feel distinctly a texture against my waist where the arm gripped me. Not skin exactly, something closer to tightly woven fabric pulled taut, ridged in places like seams, and for one disorienting second, I swear I felt tiny, precise little jabs against my side, like the blunt ends of pins pressed hard, but not quite breaking skin. My feet kicked against the footboard, trying to find any kind of leverage, and for one terrifying moment, my body actually slid a good 6 inches across the mattress, despite everything I had braced against it. The closet door across the room swinging open on its own with a soft creak, just as my grip on the headboard nearly failed. I screamed loud enough that my mum was in my doorway within seconds, flipping on the overhead light, and the grip released all at once so suddenly that I actually slid a few more inches across the mattress from my own effort before I caught myself. There was nothing visible in the room by the time the light came on, no shape retreating toward the closet or the window. Just me shaking against the headboard and my mum crossing the room fast to pull me into her arms exactly the way she used to when I was small enough to have nightmares about ordinary things. My dad appeared in the doorway a moment later, and even he, normally the first person in the house to reach for a rational explanation, stood there looking at the closet door hanging open a few inches without saying a single word about faulty hinges or drafts. It was only once she'd gotten me calmed down enough to breathe properly that we both noticed the quilt. 3 of the tight, careful stitches along that border pattern, the exact pattern Nana Iris had told me she'd invented just for this quilt and never used on any other piece she'd ever made, had come completely undone, the thread pulled loose in a way that left small, precise loops hanging off the fabric edge, as though someone had picked at them deliberately rather than the fabric simply fraying, with age or wear. My mum ran her thumb over those loose loops for a long moment, her face doing something complicated I couldn't quite read, before folding the quilt carefully back up and setting it on my dresser instead of the bed, saying only that maybe it needed a rest from being used so much so soon. My dad came in a few minutes later and offered, quietly, to hang a proper hook higher up on my wall where the quilt could be displayed like a real piece of needlework instead of stuffed in a closet or bunched on a bed, an offer that surprised me more than almost anything else that whole night, coming from the man who'd once gotten rid of a painting rather than talk about why it had moved. I didn't argue with her. For the first time since I'd put that quilt back out, I found myself almost relieved to see it folded away again, even though some smaller, more stubborn part of me still felt like folding it up amounted to the same kind of dismissal I'd already spent months regretting. The activity slowed down noticeably after that night, though it never fully stopped the way I think we all secretly hoped it would. The computer still occasionally turned itself on for no reason anyone could find, though less often than before. Callum still woke up some mornings with his blankets pulled up snug around his shoulders, though he stopped mentioning it out loud after a while. The way you stop mentioning something once it's simply become a strange fact of living in a particular house. My dad's stories from the convenience store tapered off too, though he told us years later that every so often, usually around the anniversary of her death, something small would still happen there. A lid flicking loose, the doors sliding open on an empty store. Just enough to remind him the pattern hadn't entirely gone quiet, only gone patient. Sean, my younger brother, who'd mostly been spared any of it directly up to that point, started noticing his own bedroom door creeping shut on its own some nights around then, too. Slow and quiet, rather than slammed, as though someone were closing it carefully so as not to wake him, which somehow felt worse than if it had simply banged shut. I kept the quilt folded on my dresser for a long time after that, taking it out only on particularly cold nights, always half expecting, half hoping, that something might settle across my waist again the moment I fell asleep beneath it, though nothing ever quite matched the intensity of that one night again, not while I still lived in that house. Years later, once I'd moved out on my own, Callum ended up staying in our parents' house a while longer with his fiancée, Freya, saving up together for a place of their own the same way he'd once saved up alone. Freya was the kind of person who took things like tarot cards and old family stories about strange houses seriously, in a matter-of-fact way rather than a dramatic one. And she moved into that house already half expecting, based on everything Callum had told her over the years, that she might notice something odd about it herself eventually. She'd laughed the first time he told her the story about the painting, she said later, right up until the week she moved her own things into what used to be my old bedroom, and felt the temperature drop noticeably the moment she stepped inside with the last box. She told Callum, half joking at the time, that she hoped whatever it was liked her enough to leave her belongings alone. A joke she stopped making within a month. She didn't have to wait very long. A few weeks after moving in, sleeping in what used to be my old bedroom, she woke one night to a sound she described to my mom afterward as fabric being pulled tight and released over and over, somewhere close to the foot of the bed. She said the air in the room seemed to fold in on itself near the closet, the way a curtain ripples when someone walks quickly past it. And out of that folding motion, a woman's shape gradually resolved itself, standing with her hands raised slightly in front of her, fingers moving in small, continuous motions like she was still working a needle through cloth even with nothing in her hands at all. Freya said the woman's hair was pulled back tight against her head, nothing loose or flowing about her at all, and that her whole form seemed to ripple faintly at the edges, the way fabric does in a breeze, even though the room itself was completely still. She walked, slow and unhurried, around the foot of the bed toward the closet, close enough that Freya could make out the fine, tight stitching texture running across what should have been the woman's skin, before she simply folded back into that same rippling space near the closet door and was gone. Freya told my mom she hadn't felt afraid so much as watched, the way you feel when someone studies you carefully, without saying anything, deciding something about you they weren't ready to share. And that the strangest part of the whole thing, stranger even than the woman herself, was how completely silent the room had gone the entire time. No creak of the floor, no rustle of fabric beyond that one steady pulling sound, as though the house itself had gone still to let her watch. Freya told Callum about it the next morning, matter of fact rather than frightened. The way she talked about most things she considered outside the ordinary, and Callum, who by then had heard enough family stories to take it seriously without much argument, mentioned it to my mom on the phone that same week. My mom didn't say much in response, only that it sounded about right, and that some houses and some people apparently didn't consider themselves finished with a family just because they died. Freya still lives in that house with Callum, and she tells me every so often, always in that same calm, unbothered voice, that the woman still visits, though never quite as forcefully as she did in the months after Nana Iris first died. She says she doesn't mind it, that she started thinking of it less as a haunting and more as a kind of quiet, ongoing inspection. Someone checking in on the family from time to time to make sure everything is still being looked after properly. I visited a few weeks after Freya first told everyone, mostly out of curiosity I didn't fully want to admit to myself, and ended up in my old bedroom looking for nothing in particular, just standing near that closet where Freya said the shape had disappeared. The room looked almost exactly the way I'd left it years before. The same paint on the walls, the same crack in the plaster above the window that none of us had ever gotten around to fixing. And standing there, I felt, for just a moment, that same old scorched cotton smell drifting faintly from somewhere near the closet. Gone again before I could be sure I hadn't imagined it. On the floor, tucked right up against the closet's bottom seam where the carpet met the wall, was a single loose thread, dark green, the exact unusual shade Nana Iris had used for the border stitching on my quilt. A quilt that by then had been packed away in a box in my new apartment for over a year, nowhere near that house or that room at all. I picked that thread up and held it in my palm for a long time before I finally put it in my pocket instead of leaving it on the floor, and I still have it now, tucked into a small tin on my dresser, alongside a few other things I've never quite worked up the nerve to throw away. I haven't unpacked the quilt itself since I moved, and I haven't told anyone about that thread either. Because the only way I've been able to make any sense of it turning up on that floor is to imagine the alternative, that whatever left it there had reached all the way into a locked box in a different city entirely, taken exactly what it wanted, and carried a piece of it back to somewhere far closer to home than any of us would like to believe. My madrina had looked after me since the day I was born, and for most of my childhood she lived right next door to us, close enough that I could see the kitchen light of her house from my bedroom window if I stayed up late enough. My parents always said she'd been the first person to hold me in the hospital after my own mother, insisting on it the way older women in our family sometimes insist on things nobody else feels able to argue with. And from then on, she'd simply become a fixed part of my life, as constant as either of my actual parents. She had a gift, or that's what everyone in the family called it, a way of easing a stomachache or a fever or a bad headache just by laying a folded white towel against your forehead and murmuring a prayer over it until whatever was wrong in you finally let go. I never once doubted it worked. I'd felt it work on me more times than I could count. Curled up on her worn kitchen chair with that towel warm against my skin and her voice low and steady above me. The pain draining out of my body the same way water drains slowly from a tub. Other kids in the neighborhood came to her too, sent over by their own mothers whenever a fever wouldn't break or a stomach wouldn't settle. And I remember feeling a strange, private pride watching them sit in that same chair I'd sat in myself so many times, as though her gift belonged a little bit to me too, simply because I'd known her longest. There was something almost magnetic about just being near her, the kind of calm that settles over a room when someone completely certain of themselves walks into it. I loved her more than almost anyone else in my life growing up, and most of my early memories are tangled up somehow with the smell of her kitchen, cigarette smoke and boiling herbs, and the particular staticky hum of her old countertop radio, which she kept tuned to the news and which lost its signal at strange, unpredictable moments while she cooked, crackling into static for a few seconds before finding its station again. She never seemed bothered by it the way another person might, never smacked the side of it or fussed with the antenna, just kept stirring whatever was on the stove and waited, patient as ever, for the voice on the other end to find its way back to her. I noticed things about her, even as a small child, that I couldn't quite explain. Moments when she'd seemed to drift somewhere else entirely while I was sitting right there with her. She'd turn toward the kitchen window sometimes and speak quietly in languages I didn't recognize, not quite talking to herself, and not quite talking to me either. More like she was answering someone standing just outside that only she could see. She never scared me when she did it. If anything, watching her speak so calmly to something invisible made the invisible thing feel less frightening by association, the same way a parent's steady voice can make a thunderstorm feel smaller than it actually is. Sometimes, mid-sentence, she'd simply stop whatever story she was telling me and go still for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on some middle distance past my shoulder, before picking the story back up again exactly where she'd left off, as though nothing had happened at all. I'm ashamed to admit now that there was a stretch, when I was around 11 or 12, when I started feeling embarrassed by all of it instead of comforted. A couple of friends from school had come over to play in our yard one afternoon, and through the fence, I could hear my madrina's voice rising and falling in that same unfamiliar rhythm, her radio hissing loudly with static in the background. And I remember steering my friends quickly toward the other side of the yard, praying they hadn't heard any of it clearly enough to ask questions. One of them asked, anyway, what that noise was, and I told her it was just my neighbor's old television. A lie that came out of me so fast I surprised myself. And I remember the hot flush of shame that followed, not because I'd been caught, but because some part of me understood even then that I'd just been ashamed of the person who loved me most in the world. I avoided visiting her as often after that, not because anything had actually changed about her, but because I'd started measuring her against what I imagined my friends would think, and I hated myself a little for it even at the time, though not enough to stop doing it. Our house had 2 floors, my bedroom upstairs at the front, looking out over the narrow strip of yard that separated our place from hers. I could see her kitchen window from my bed if I propped myself up against the pillows. And some nights, before any of what happened later started, I used to watch her light flick on, late, long after my own parents had gone to sleep, and feel oddly comforted just knowing she was still awake on the other side of that gap. Downstairs, my parents' room sat at the back of the house, far enough from mine that anything short of a real scream would never have reached them. A detail that only ever occurred to me much later, once I understood exactly how loud I must have been that final night to wake them both so fast. About 6 months before everything changed, I started having trouble in my room at night that I couldn't put a name to at first. I'd lie there completely exhausted, desperate to fall asleep, and instead feel a kind of pressure settle over the room, an invisible weight pressing down that made even blinking feel like an effort. Some nights I'd catch, right at the edge of hearing, a thin, steady hum, almost like the sound our television made right before it fully warmed up, except there was no television on anywhere in the house at that hour. The lamp on my nightstand would sometimes dim for a few seconds without fully going out, the light stuttering the way it does during a brownout, though my dad checked the fuse box twice and found nothing wrong with the wiring anywhere in the house. I mentioned it to my madrina once, expecting her to laugh it off the way she usually did with childish fears, and instead she went very still, her cigarette burning down, forgotten between her fingers, and told me, in a voice much more serious than I was used to hearing from her, that she'd keep an eye on my room from then on, that I shouldn't worry, that some things like to test the house before they ever tried to come inside it properly. She started coming over most evenings after that, under one excuse or another, always finding a reason to pass through my room on her way to somewhere else in the house, laying a folded white towel briefly against my bedroom doorframe and murmuring something under her breath before moving on. A small private ritual she never fully explained, and I never quite worked up the nerve to ask about directly. Some nights, she'd stay longer than the ritual actually required, sitting on the edge of my bed telling me stories about her own childhood until I finally drifted off. And it wasn't until much later that I understood those extra minutes had probably been as much about her own reluctance to leave the room unguarded as they were about comforting me. The first time it actually came into my room, rather than just pressing against the edges of it, was on a night about 2 months before she died, though of course none of us knew yet how close that was. I woke up somewhere around midnight to that same low hum, much louder than it had ever been before, loud enough that it felt like it was coming from somewhere just to the left of my bed, rather than from anywhere in the walls or the wiring. The air in the room had gone thick and staticky, the way it feels right before a big storm, the fine hairs on my arms standing straight up. And when I finally forced myself to look toward the source of that sound, there was a tall, upright shape standing near my closet, made of nothing I could properly describe, except the same fine, buzzing interference you'd see on an old television tuned to a dead channel, its edges never quite settling into a solid outline. flickering slightly the way static does across a screen. My bedside lamp, still switched on from when I'd fallen asleep reading, guttered down to almost nothing the instant I laid eyes on it, as though the shape were drawing whatever power it needed straight out of the bulb itself. It didn't have a face I could make out, just that constant, low-level visual noise where a face should have been, and before I could even scream. It moved toward the bed faster than anything that indistinct should have been able to move, one arm, or something like an arm, reaching out and closing around my wrist with a grip that felt like touching a doorknob after walking across carpet in socks, a sharp, unpleasant jolt that made my whole arm go numb from the shock of it. I screamed then, finally, and tried to yank my arm free, and for a few terrible seconds it held on, pulling steadily toward the closet the way you'd pull a stuck drawer, my whole body sliding a few inches across the mattress before my madrina's voice suddenly cut through the room from the doorway, sharp and commanding in a language I still didn't understand, followed almost immediately by the wet slap of a folded white towel against the static shape itself. I remember, even through the panic, how strange it was to watch that towel actually connect with something that otherwise looked like it shouldn't have had any surface at all to strike. The fabric momentarily flattening against an invisible resistance, the way it would against a solid wall. A fine spray of what looked almost like sparks scattering outward from the point of impact. The shape seemed to flinch away from wherever the towel had touched it, its grip on my wrist loosening just enough that I managed to wrench my arm free the rest of the way myself, scrambling backward across the mattress until I hit the headboard. The grip on my wrist let go all at once, and the shape convulsed inward on itself like a picture folding closed, collapsing down into a single point of hissing static before winking out entirely, leaving the room suddenly, completely silent, the kind of ringing silence that comes right after a very loud noise stops. The smell that followed reminded me, oddly, of the inside of an old television set left running too long, warm dust and heated plastic, and it lingered in my room for the better part of an hour afterward, no matter how wide I left the window open. My madrina stood in the doorway afterward, breathing hard, one hand braced against the frame, looking older in that moment than I'd ever seen her look before, her cigarette long since dropped and forgotten somewhere on the hallway carpet outside. She didn't explain much that night, beyond telling me I was safe now and that she wasn't going anywhere, tucking the same white towel she'd used against the thing into the crack under my bedroom door before she finally went home, sometime near dawn. I remember lying awake long after she'd left, staring at that towel wedged against the gap, half convinced it was the only thing standing between me and whatever might still be waiting on the other side of it, until exhaustion finally won out and pulled me under. In the morning, there was a faint, blotchy mark circling my wrist. Not quite a bruise and not quite a burn. More like the pattern you get pressing your arm against a patterned radiator grill for too long, an uneven lattice of small red marks that took almost 2 weeks to fully fade. My alarm clock on the nightstand nearest the closet never worked properly again after that night either, its display flickering with the same fine static interference no matter how many times my dad replaced the batteries or eventually just threw the whole thing away. My mom asked me twice that week whether I'd been having nightmares, and both times I told her yes without elaborating, unwilling to say anything more specific out loud, as though naming it too clearly might somehow call it back. For a while after that, things were quiet. Quiet enough that I let myself half believe whatever had happened that night had been a one-time thing, something my madrina had successfully driven off for good. Looking back now, I think that quiet was less a victory and more the sound of her spending down whatever reserves she had left to buy me that peace. though at the time I only noticed that she seemed more tired than usual, that her cough, which I'd always just thought of as a smoker's cough, seemed to be getting worse, that she sat down more often mid-sentence than she used to. She started keeping a folding chair just inside her own kitchen door that she'd never needed before, and once, catching me watching her lower herself into it a little too carefully, she laughed it off as her knees finally catching up with her age. A joke I believed completely at the time, because I wanted to. Nobody told me she was sick. I don't know, even now, whether my parents knew themselves, or whether she'd kept that particular secret as carefully guarded as she kept everything else about herself that didn't fit neatly into an explanation. The radio in her kitchen kept losing its signal more and more often as those weeks went on, sometimes for whole stretches of a minute or more, instead of the few seconds it used to cut out for, filling her kitchen with a low static hiss that from my bedroom window sounded uncomfortably close to the hum I'd heard the night that thing grabbed my wrist. I started avoiding looking toward her kitchen window at night after a while, not because I thought anything was actually wrong over there, but because the sound carried a memory I didn't want to sit with right before falling asleep. A couple of times I caught her standing at that same window late at night, still as a photograph, facing out toward the dark yard between our two houses. And I never once worked up the nerve to ask her what she was watching for. The night everything happened, I remember lying in bed, feeling that same old pressure pressing down on the room again, worse than it had been in months, thick enough that closing my eyes and opening them again felt like the only way to convince myself I was actually still breathing normally. I lay there for what felt like hours, blinking against the weight of it, willing myself towards sleep and getting nowhere close. The hum building slowly in the background the entire time, patient in a way that felt worse than the sudden appearance of it the first time around. At some point, I actually got up and pressed my palm flat against my bedroom door, some half-formed instinct telling me to check whether it was locked. Though, of course, it already was, the way it always was every single night since that first bad encounter. I don't remember the exact moment I finally fell asleep, only what came after. I started foaming at the mouth without any warning at all, my whole body seizing and shaking in a way I had no control over whatsoever. A low humming sound rising up out of my own throat that got louder and louder, no matter how much some small, distant part of my mind screamed at myself to stop making it. Later, my mom described it to me the way you describe watching someone drown right in front of you, while somehow being completely unable to reach them fast enough. And I think that's the closest any of us ever got to putting into words exactly how helpless that whole night made all three of us feel. My parents came crashing into the room, disturbed out of their own sleep by whatever horrible noise I was making. My dad's hands on my shoulders trying to hold me still while my mum shouted my name over and over. Both of them clearly terrified and completely unable to understand what was happening to their own child in front of them. The whole time my body thrashed on that bed, I was somewhere else entirely. Caught in a dream so vivid, it felt more like being physically transported than sleeping. I was standing in a version of my madrina's kitchen, the radio hissing static loud enough to hurt. Every surface in that dream kitchen slightly wrong in the way dreams get things wrong. The calendar on her wall showing a month that didn't exist. The window looking out onto a yard that stretched much further than our actual one ever did. She was there too, standing just a few feet away from me, wearing the same faded blue house dress I'd seen her in 100 times before, and I remember running toward her, desperate to throw my arms around her the way I used to as a small child, only for her to simply not be there anymore the instant I reached the spot where she'd been standing. Already reappeared somewhere else across that same kitchen, calm and steady and just out of reach. I tried again and again, sprinting across a floor that never seemed to get any shorter, my chest burning, my Madrina reappearing each time a few feet further away, never once looking frightened herself, only sad. The particular sad expression of someone saying goodbye to something they love very much and can't take with them. At one point in that dream, I remember shouting at her to stop moving, to just let me reach her this one time, and she only shook her head slowly, mouthing something I couldn't hear over the static. Her lips forming words I've spent years since trying to reconstruct and never quite managing to. Back in my actual bedroom, my body kept shaking through all of that, sweat soaking through my shirt. The foam at the corners of my mouth thick enough that my mum had to wipe it away twice with the sleeve of her own robe, my dad's voice cracking as he begged me to open my eyes, to come back, to just breathe. The humming sound I was making seemed to sync up, impossibly, with the rise and fall of static in that dream kitchen, both of them swelling together towards something neither one of us, dreaming or awake, seemed able to stop. My dad told me afterward that at one point he'd actually pressed his ear to my chest, terrified my heart itself had somehow started making that sound, before realizing it was coming from somewhere deeper in my throat entirely. A noise he said he still sometimes heard in his own head on quiet nights years later. When I finally did open my eyes, gasping, my whole body still trembling with the last of the shakes working their way out of my muscles, the first thing I saw wasn't my parents' faces hovering over me. It was the window across the room, and standing just outside it, close enough that her breath should have fogged the glass in the cold night air, though it didn't, was my Madrina, looking directly at me with an expression I've spent years since trying to properly describe and never quite managing. Love and exhaustion, and a kind of fierce protective relief, all tangled together at once. She was wearing that same faded blue house dress from the dream, and for just a moment her lips moved again, shaping the same silent words I hadn't been able to make out in that impossible kitchen, before she held my gaze for one long, impossible second. And then she was simply gone. The window glass perfectly clear and undisturbed, as though nobody had ever been standing there at all. The humming sound that had filled my room all night cut off completely in that same instant, so abruptly that the silence afterward felt like its own kind of pressure against my ears. My parents, still gripping my shoulders, both turned to follow my stare toward that empty window, and neither of them saw anything there at all, though my mum told me years later that for one strange moment, standing in that doorway, she'd smelled cigarette smoke so strongly and so suddenly that she'd actually turned to check whether someone had lit one somewhere in the house. We found out the next afternoon, once my parents had finally reached her house and gotten no answer at the door, that my Madrina had died sometime that same morning, alone in her bed. From lung cancer, none of us had known she was fighting. The neighbor who eventually helped my dad force the back door open told him afterward that the radio in her kitchen had been on when they found her, playing nothing but a steady wall of static, loud enough to hear from the yard, and that nobody had thought to turn it off until well after the paramedics had already come and gone. The doctors said afterward that, given how advanced it already was, by the time anyone found her, she must have been carrying that diagnosis for months, quietly, without telling a single person in the family, going on exactly as she always had, right up until the night her own body finally gave out at almost precisely the hour mine had started seizing in that bed across the yard from hers. My mum cried for a long time in the kitchen once she got off the phone with the coroner's office, repeating over and over that she should have noticed, that she should have pushed harder when my Madrina waved off questions about her cough. And I sat there beside her, unable to say the thing I was actually thinking, which was that I hadn't noticed either. Too busy those last few months being embarrassed by the very person who'd spent that same stretch of time fighting something off in my bedroom that none of us even knew existed. My dad didn't cry, not that day, just sat at the kitchen table turning his coffee mug in slow circles for what felt like an hour. And it wasn't until the funeral itself that I finally saw him break down completely, gripping the edge of the casket like it was the only thing keeping him upright. I've never been able to properly explain what happened that night to anyone who wasn't already inclined to believe in the kind of gift my madrina carried her whole life, and I've mostly stopped trying. A doctor we saw afterward, once my parents finally worked up the nerve to mention the seizure itself, ran a whole battery of tests and found absolutely nothing wrong with me. No history of epilepsy, no explanation for the foaming or the shaking or the marks on my wrist. Just a healthy kid who apparently, for one single night of his life, had gone through something medicine had no box to file away. He kept asking, gently, whether I had been under any unusual stress lately. School pressures or family trouble, anything that might explain a single isolated episode like that. And each time I said no, watching him write something down anyway that I never got to read. Some private diagnosis of his own that had nothing to do with the truth of what had actually happened in that room. What I can tell you is that the static mark on my wrist took weeks to fade completely, longer than any ordinary bruise ever should have, and that my parents kept that ruined alarm clock in a box in the garage for years afterward, rather than simply throwing it away. Unwilling, I think, to get rid of the one piece of physical proof that any of it had actually happened the way I said it did. Her house sat empty for almost a year before anyone in the family could bring themselves to clear it out properly, longer than any of us had planned. The mortgage quietly paid off in the meantime by an aunt none of us had even known she'd trusted with that kind of responsibility. When my mom finally did go through the kitchen, she found that old countertop radio still sitting exactly where it had always sat, unplugged, its cord neatly coiled beside it, the way my madrina always left it overnight. Everything else in that kitchen had been cleared out weeks before, cabinets emptied, the folding chair by the door given away along with most of the furniture. But nobody, my mom told me later, could quite bring themselves to touch that radio until the very last day, as though some part of all of us understood it wasn't just an appliance sitting there, still faintly warm, she swore, though it had been unplugged and untouched for months. My mom brought it back to our house without really thinking about why, setting it on a shelf in our own kitchen more as a keepsake than anything meant to actually work again, plugging it in exactly once to see if it still powered on at all, and then never touching the cord again after that first test confirmed it did. It's still there now, years later, sitting dark and silent, most of the time, except for the handful of occasions, always late at night, always when the house is otherwise completely quiet, that I've come downstairs to find it hissing softly with static all on its own, unplugged, exactly the way it always used to right before her voice would cut back in through it, and exactly the way it never quite has again. I've stood in that kitchen more than once, waiting, half hoping and half dreading that this might finally be the time the hiss resolves into something I can understand, and every single time, after a few long seconds, the sound simply fades back into silence on its own, leaving the radio exactly as dark and unplugged as it was before, and me standing there in the dark not sure whether I've just missed something or been spared from it. I've lived alone in this house for almost 11 years now, ever since Mark and I finally admitted to each other that we couldn't keep sharing a roof with the kind of grief we were both carrying, not without it slowly turning us into people neither of us recognized. It's a small place, just 2 bedrooms and a bathroom off a short hallway, a kitchen and living room at the front. The sort of house young couples buy thinking they'll grow into it. We never got the chance to grow into it the way we'd planned. Lily was 6 when she got sick, and 5 months later she was gone, and after that the second bedroom just became a door I walked past every single day without ever quite letting myself open it. I still remember the exact week it started. A fever that wouldn't break, and a tiredness that seemed too heavy for a 6-year-old to be carrying. And how quickly the word the doctors eventually used turned our whole ordinary life into a series of hospital corridors and quiet conversations held just out of my hearing. Mark and I took turns sitting with her through those last months, trading off so neither of us would have to be alone in that hospital room for too many hours at a stretch. And I remember thinking, stupidly, that surely a house this small and this ordinary couldn't possibly be the place where something this enormous ended up happening to us. We'd painted her room ourselves the summer before she got sick. A soft, buttery yellow she'd picked out from a whole wall of paint chips at the hardware store, insisting on the exact shade with the stubbornness only a 6-year-old can really commit to. And I remember standing in that half-finished room afterward, rollers still in my hand, thinking we had years ahead of us to slowly fill it with whatever she'd grow into next. Posters and different furniture and all the ordinary clutter of a childhood I never got to watch play out. I kept her room exactly the way it was the week she went into hospital for the last time. The bedspread with the faded rabbits on it still pulled up neat over her pillow. Her hairbrush still sitting on the little white dresser, with a few strands of her hair still caught in the bristles, because I could never quite bring myself to throw that particular thing away. Once a year, on the date, I'd go in and dust everything carefully, run a cloth over the windowsill and the dresser top, and lock the door again behind me on my way out. The same small ritual every single year. The only time I allowed myself to actually sit on the edge of her bed and remember her properly, instead of just carrying her around as a permanent ache in my chest. I never told anyone about that yearly visit either, not even my sister. Some part of me guarding it the same careful way I guarded the memory of her voice, afraid that saying it out loud too often might wear the edges off it the way saying any word too many times eventually makes it stop sounding like a real word at all, the syllables going strange and unfamiliar in your own mouth. There's a version of that last week I've never told anyone. Not Mark, not my sister, nobody. The night before she went into the coma she never came out of, she'd asked me to stay a little longer, tugging at my sleeve the way she did when she wanted something, and already half suspected the answer would be no, and I'd told her I needed to go home and get some sleep myself, promising I'd be back first thing in the morning. I was back first thing in the morning. It didn't matter. Some part of me has spent 11 years unable to let go of the fact that the last real conversation I ever had with my daughter ended with me leaving the room, choosing my own exhaustion over one more hour at her bedside. And no amount of telling myself that any reasonable mother would have done exactly the same thing has ever managed to fully quiet that particular voice in my head. Mark moved out about 2 years after we lost her. Not out of anger, just out of the slow exhaustion of two people who couldn't find their way back to each other through all that grief. Each of us grieving in a way the other one couldn't quite stand to be near for very long. He offered more than once to help me sell the house and start somewhere new, gently, the way you'd offer something to someone you loved but no longer fully understood. I never could. Some part of me needed to stay exactly where the last of her still lingered, in the height marks penciled onto the doorframe of the hallway bathroom, and the particular creak of the third stair that used to announce her coming down for breakfast. In 100 small details, Mark had already started letting himself forget by the time he packed up his side of the closet. For years, living alone there was simply quiet, in the ordinary way houses get quiet once the people who used to fill them are gone. Nothing more unsettling than the sound of my own kettle or the neighbor's car pulling into their drive at odd hours. I'd built a life around that quiet, a job at the local surgery that kept my days full, a sister who called every Sunday to check on me, a routine sturdy enough that most weeks I could go entire stretches without the grief catching me off guard in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. It was only in the months before everything changed that the house started feeling different in ways I couldn't easily explain. Small enough at first that I mostly managed to talk myself out of noticing them properly. The first thing I actually remember clearly was the hallway light. It was an old fixture, original to the house, and it had always flickered a little when you first switched it on, the way old bulbs do before they settle into a steady glow. That winter, it started doing something different, flickering on its own in the middle of the night when nobody had touched the switch at all, waking me some nights with a faint strip of light bleeding under my bedroom door from the hallway outside. I'd get up, annoyed more than frightened, flip the switch off myself, and go back to bed telling myself the wiring in a house that old was bound to act up eventually. My neighbor's husband, who does a bit of electrical work on the side, came round and checked the whole circuit for me one Saturday, running his tester along every connection in that hallway twice, and found absolutely nothing wrong with any of it, wiring as solid as the day the house was built, which somehow made the flickering feel worse rather than better once I had nothing left to blame it on. He joked on his way out that maybe the house just liked to keep me company at odd hours, and I laughed along with him at the time, though the joke sat differently with me once I was alone again. A few weeks after that, I woke up one night to find a very faint glow coming from under Lily's door, the kind of soft, warm light a small nightlight gives off. Except there was no nightlight plugged in anywhere in that room, hadn't been for years, and the lamp on her dresser had sat unplugged since the week we lost her. I stood in the hallway staring at that thin strip of light under her door for a long time, my heart going harder than it had any business doing over something so small, before I finally worked up the nerve to try the handle. It was locked, exactly the way I always kept it, the same old brass key still sitting in the lock the way it always did. By the time I'd gotten the door open, the light under it had already gone out, and the room inside looked exactly the way it always looked, dark and undisturbed, her hairbrush sitting on the dresser right where I'd left it. I stood in that doorway a long while afterward, key still in my hand, telling myself I'd simply imagined the light bleeding under the door, the same way you tell yourself you imagined a sound in an empty house, wanting badly to believe it even as some part of me kept circling back to how certain I'd been in that first clear moment of waking. I started sleeping worse after that, not because I truly believed anything was wrong so much as because some small, stubborn part of my brain wouldn't stop turning the question over. A week or so later, I woke in the middle of the night, absolutely certain I'd heard something. A thin, high sound that took me a long moment to place. And once I did place it, I almost wished I hadn't. It sounded like a child humming, tuneless and quiet, coming from somewhere down the hall, the same wandering, half-formed tune Lily used to hum to herself while she colored at the kitchen table. A habit so specific to her that hearing even a rough echo of it sent a jolt straight through my chest. I lay frozen in bed listening to it for what felt like a full minute before it simply stopped. And in the morning I told myself, the way you do, that I'd been half asleep, that grief plays tricks on a lonely house at 3 a.m, that there were a dozen ordinary explanations for a sound like that if I really wanted to go looking for them. The real proof, the thing that finally made me stop pretending any of this was ordinary, came about 2 weeks before the night everything happened. I woke up one morning to find Lily's old hairbrush sitting on my own pillow, right beside my head, close enough that I must have been sleeping practically next to it all night without ever waking. I hadn't been in her room in months. I keep that key on a hook by my own bed specifically, so I'm never tempted to go wandering in there without meaning to, and it was still hanging exactly where it always hung. I checked the lock on her door twice that same morning, my hands not quite steady, and found it fastened exactly the way I'd left it. No scratch marks around the keyhole. Nothing to suggest anyone had picked or forced it open from either side. I sat there holding that brush for a long time that morning, turning it over in my hands, running my thumb across those few strands of hair still caught in the bristles, unable to decide whether I felt comforted or completely undone by the idea that she might somehow still be moving through this house at night while I slept. I put the brush back myself that same afternoon, locked her door again behind me, and told myself, out loud, standing alone in that hallway, that whatever was happening, I needed to actually see it for myself before I let my imagination build it into something worse than it might really be. I even considered, briefly, calling Mark before deciding against it, unwilling to hand him one more reason to worry about me from 3 towns away, unwilling, too, if I'm honest, to hear the careful, patient way he'd try to talk me out of believing my own eyes. The same tone he used to use in those last exhausted months at the hospital, whenever I insisted I could see her getting stronger. I got my chance a little over a week later. I woke suddenly, for no reason I could point to, in the deep, still hours of the night, the kind of waking that comes with no dream attached to it at all. Just a sudden, total alertness. The way you snap awake sometimes, right before an alarm is about to go off. Except my alarm was hours away, and nothing outside had made a sound. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up before I'd even fully processed being awake. That specific prickling sensation you get when every instinct in your body is telling you you're not alone in a room you know for a fact should be empty. I lay still for a moment, listening, and heard nothing at all. Not even the ordinary tick of the house settling. A silence so complete it felt like its own kind of pressure against my ears, thick enough that I found myself straining to hear even the sound of my own breathing. I sat up slowly and reached for the lamp on my nightstand, some part of me already braced for what the light might show me, and switched it on. My hand hovered over the switch for 1 full second before I actually made contact. Some instinct warring against the desperate need to know what was standing close enough in the dark for me to feel that prickle running down my neck. And then I flicked it on anyway, because whatever was there, I needed to see it more than I needed to stay safely blind to it. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was a little girl in a long, white nightshirt, old-fashioned in its cut, high at the collar, with a row of small buttons running down the front, the kind of thing you'd see in an old photograph rather than on any child today. She wasn't looking at the floor or off to the side the way you'd expect a frightened child to look. She was looking directly at me, and the moment the lamp light fell across her, she smiled, slow and deliberate, a smile that didn't carry a single trace of warmth in it, despite the shape of it being, on its own, perfectly sweet. Her hair hung loose past her shoulders, darker than Lily's had ever been, and her bare feet, pale against the carpet, didn't seem to press down into the pile the way an ordinary child's weight would have. No dent or flattening of the fibers beneath her the whole time she stood there. What struck me most, even in that first frozen second, was that the light hadn't made her disappear the way every ghost story I'd ever half believed always promised it would. If anything, she seemed clearer under that lamplight than she had any right to be. Every detail of that nightshirt crisp and solid, the buttons catching a small gleam from the bulb the way real fabric would. And it was only when my eyes dropped, involuntarily, to the wall behind her that the wrongness of it really landed in my stomach. Her shadow, thrown up tall against the wallpaper by the lamp beside me, didn't match her at all. Where she stood upright and still, smiling that terrible small smile, the shadow behind her showed something hunched down low, arms thrown up and crossed in front of its face, the unmistakable shape of someone flinching away from a blow that never seemed to land. I sat there, staring between the two of them, the calm little girl and the cowering shadow that belonged to her, unable to make my body do anything at all for what felt like a very long time. She turned, unhurried, and walked toward my open bedroom door, and I sat there for one more paralyzed second before something in me, some desperate, aching grief hollowed part of me that had spent 11 years wishing for exactly this kind of impossible visit, overrode every ounce of sense I had left. I got up and followed her, my bare feet finding the hallway floorboards cold in a way the central heating should never have allowed on a night like that. The hallway was freezing, far colder than any ordinary night should have made it, cold enough that I could see my own breath fog in front of me as I hurried after that small white shape gliding ahead of me toward the far end of the hall. Her nightshirt seemed to catch what little light there was and hold on to it, a faint pale glow trailing after her like the last light of a television screen a few seconds after it's switched off, and I remember thinking, absurdly, in the middle of everything, how quiet her feet were against a floor that always creaked under my own weight, no matter how carefully I walked it. She reached Lily's door and simply passed through it without opening it at all, and I stopped dead in front of that door myself, staring at the thin gap beneath it, where a soft light was now glowing steadily, warmer and stronger than anything I'd seen leaking out from under there before. I tried the handle with shaking fingers and found it, impossibly, already unlocked, though the brass key was still hanging on its hook by my own bed exactly where I'd left it that same evening. The door swung open easily under my hand, and the room beyond it was lit, somehow, by a small lamp on the dresser that had sat unplugged and dead for 11 straight years, its little pastel shade glowing warm and steady the way it used to on the nights I'd leave it on, for her as a small child afraid of the dark. The little girl stood in the middle of that room with her back to me, facing the far wall, perfectly still, close enough to Lily's old bed that the hem of that white nightshirt brushed against the faded rabbits on the bedspread. Every rational thought I had left told me to stop right there in the doorway, and every single thing left in me that still loved my daughter pulled me forward instead, my voice breaking as I said her name out loud for the first time in longer than I could remember saying it to anyone but myself, the word coming out smaller and more broken than I intended, half question and half prayer. She turned around at the sound of it far too quickly, a motion that covered 180 degrees in less time than it should have taken to shift even a few inches. The hem of her nightshirt, lagging half a second behind the rest of her like fabric, caught in a strong wind that only touched her. And the face that turned toward me wasn't Lily's face at all. Wasn't really a face in any proper sense. Just a smooth, pale blankness where features should have been, like a photograph left out in direct sunlight for years until nothing but a faint ghost of an outline remained. The smile, though, that same small, deliberate smile, was still somehow there, stretched across that blank space in a way that made my whole body lock up with a fear more complete than anything I'd felt since the night we lost her for real. It crossed the distance between us before I could even think to step back, one small hand closing around my wrist with a grip that burned cold straight through to the bone. Fingers, or something like fingers, wrapping all the way around with a strength no child's hand should have carried. I felt myself being pulled hard toward the narrow gap of open closet door on the far side of that room, my feet skidding across the same worn carpet I used to kneel on reading her bedtime stories, And I screamed, finally, a raw, ugly sound torn straight out of me, and threw my whole weight backward against that pull with everything I had left in my body. My free hand caught the edge of the dresser as I fought against that grip, my fingers scrabbling for purchase against the smooth painted wood. And for one wild second, I registered the hairbrush toppling off its edge and clattering to the floor, the same brush I'd held that morning, wondering whether I felt comforted or undone by all of this, now skittering away across the carpet somewhere behind me. The closet door ahead of us stood open perhaps 8 inches, no more, a black gap that seemed impossibly wide enough to accommodate whatever it was that thing intended to drag me through. And some animal part of my brain understood with total certainty that I could not let myself be pulled through that gap, no matter what it cost me to stay out of it. I could hear or feel something shifting in the dark beyond that gap, a soft rustle of fabric that didn't belong to the coats and old boxes I knew were actually stored in there. And the thought of whatever else might be waiting on the other side of that darkness gave me a burst of strength I didn't know I still had left in me. For one endless second, neither of us gave an inch, that cold grip locked around my wrist, my heels dragging grooves into the carpet as I fought to stay upright. And then, all at once, the grip simply released, and I stumbled backward hard enough to crack my shoulder against the doorframe on my way out into the hallway. The lamp on the dresser went dark in that same instant, plunging the room back into ordinary blackness, and I didn't wait around to see what, if anything, was still standing in it. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut with both hands, twisting the old brass key that had somehow found its way back into the lock, though I couldn't have told you when. I sat on the hallway floor for a long time after that, my back against the wall opposite her door, shaking too hard to trust my own legs to carry me anywhere else in the house, watching that thin gap beneath the door for any sign of light or movement until the sky outside finally started to lighten toward morning. Somewhere in that long stretch of watching, I remember pressing my own frozen wrist against my chest, feeling the cold radiating off it through my nightshirt, and being struck by the strange, useless thought that I hadn't even managed to see whether the girl's face had changed back to anything at all before that lamp went dark, whether there had been a version of her left in there afterward that still looked like a little girl in a white nightshirt, or something else entirely. I thought, too, about all those years I'd spent wishing for exactly this kind of impossible visit, some sign that she wasn't simply gone, and how differently I'd always pictured it going. Nothing at all like crouched on a freezing hallway floor with my wrist burning cold and my heart still slamming against my ribs. In the daylight, my wrist showed a ring of pale, frost-colored marks circling it, banded and uneven, cold to the touch for hours afterward, no matter how long I ran it under warm water. I photographed it on my phone before the marks had a chance to fade, some instinct telling me I'd want proof of this later, even if I never showed it to another living soul. And I still have that photo saved somewhere, though I've never once gone looking for it again since the week it happened. I found, later that same day, that the door to Lily's room, which had swung so easily open the night before despite being locked, now refused to sit flush in its frame no matter how many times I adjusted the hinges, leaving a thin, permanent gap along the top edge that no amount of planing or tightening ever fully closed again. The little lamp on her dresser, when I finally worked up the nerve to check it, had blown its bulb completely, the glass gone dark and faintly scorched on the inside, though it had never once been plugged into the wall the whole time it sat there. I stood there holding that scorched, unplugged bulb in my palm for a long time, the same way I'd once held her hairbrush, trying and failing to make the two facts sit together in any way that made sense. I never saw her again after that night, not once, not in 11 years since. and some small part of me still doesn't know whether to be grateful for that or heartbroken by it. I did eventually clear the room out, about a year later, giving away the bed and the dresser to a charity that came to collect them, keeping only the hairbrush and a small box of her drawings for myself, though I couldn't bring myself to repaint the walls or change the carpet, not even after everything. My sister asked me once, gently, whether I regretted following that little girl into the room at all, whether some part of me wished I'd simply stayed in bed with the light on and let the whole thing pass without ever finding out what was waiting behind that door. I told her no, and I meant it, though I've never quite been able to explain to her why, except to say that after 11 years of wondering what, if anything, was left of my daughter in this world, some part of me needed to know for certain, even if what I found wasn't her at all, even if all it left me with was a scar-cold wrist and a door that never sits quite right in its frame anymore. What I can tell you is that the hall light, that same old fixture that used to flicker its way to a steady glow, has never once flickered on its own again since that morning. And every single bulb I've ever put into the fixture in what used to be Lily's room, no matter the brand or the wattage, burns out within a matter of weeks, far faster than any bulb has any business failing, faster than every other light in this house combined. A small, quiet, unexplainable fact of living here that I've simply learned to live alongside, the way you learn to live alongside anything you can't afford to look at too closely. I keep a spare bulb in the drawer beneath that lamp now, already unwrapped and ready, because some part of me has stopped bothering to ask why, and started simply expecting that I'll need it again before the month is out. We moved into that house when my wife Claire was still adjusting to being a new mother, our daughter barely 3 months old, and the whole subdivision around us was still mostly empty lots, bare dirt and surveyor stakes where houses were supposed to go eventually. We were one of maybe 6 families who'd actually moved in that early, scattered across streets that were otherwise just curbs and streetlights standing guard over nothing. The kind of half-built neighborhood that looks a little apocalyptic at night once the construction crews have all gone home for the day. We'd bought there because it was all we could afford on a young family's budget. A brand new house at a brand new development price. And the real estate agent had made a point of telling us how quickly the rest of the lots were expected to fill in, as though that alone might make the emptiness feel temporary rather than permanent. Claire had a rougher time of it than I did those first few months. Up most nights with the baby while I still had to drag myself into work every morning, and I remember the two of us joking, in the exhausted way new parents joke about everything, that at least the quiet out there meant nobody complained about crying at 3 in the morning. Neither of us had grown up anywhere quite that isolated, and there was an adjustment period neither of us had fully accounted for, learning to sleep through a silence that wasn't peaceful so much as simply empty. The house itself was a fairly standard 2-story build. Our bedroom and the baby's room upstairs, kitchen and living room downstairs, with the front entryway recessed a couple of feet into the house itself, tucked back under an overhang so you couldn't actually see the front step from the kitchen window without leaning forward and looking down at an angle. The builder had put that recessed entry in mostly for the look of it, a small architectural flourish meant to make the front of the house feel a little grander than the modest square footage actually delivered, and I remember Claire commenting, back when we first walked through the place with the agent, that it gave the front door a strange, sunken feeling, like stepping down into a little alcove rather than up onto an ordinary porch. The kitchen sat almost directly across from that front door, separated only by a short stretch of hallway, close enough that I could hear someone's fists against the wood the second it started. The backyard was the one thing about that house I'd been genuinely proud of building myself that first summer. A solid fence running the entire perimeter, close to 15 feet of sheer, flat-faced wooden planks with no cross beams or footholds on the outside at all, capped with a heavy top rail, and secured with real deadbolt locks on both gates, rather than the flimsy latches most of our neighbors eventually put up. I'd spent the better part of 3 weekends on that fence, sinking the posts deep enough into concrete that my own father, visiting once it was finished, joked I'd built something meant to survive a hurricane rather than keep out a stray dog. We'd built it that tall mostly to keep the coyotes and the occasional stray dog out, since the empty lots around us were still more wild than developed, and I remember feeling, that first year, like we'd built ourselves a genuinely safe little island in the middle of all that unfinished dirt. For the first few months, nothing about living out there felt unusual, beyond the ordinary strangeness of a neighborhood that wasn't finished yet. Streetlights buzzing over empty curbs, the distant grind of construction equipment starting up most weekday mornings a few streets over. It was quiet in a way that took some getting used to, especially at night, when the absence of other houses meant an absence of other porch lights, too. Whole stretches of the development sitting in a kind of deep, complete darkness, broken only by our own windows and maybe one or two others further down the block. Some evenings, standing at the kitchen sink doing dishes after Claire had gone up to feed the baby, I'd catch myself staring out at that darkness longer than the task in front of me really required. Unable to say exactly what I was looking for out there, only that some part of me kept expecting to eventually find something. About a month before everything happened, I started noticing small things I couldn't quite dismiss, though at the time none of them felt serious enough to mention to Claire and risk worrying her over nothing. A car I didn't recognize sat idling at the far end of our cul-de-sac one evening for close to 20 minutes. No lights on inside it, gone by the time I looked out again after putting the baby down. Our neighbor 2 doors down, one of the only other families who'd moved in early, mentioned to me over the fence one Saturday that she'd seen someone walking slowly through the empty lots behind our street a couple of nights running, moving between the surveyor stakes like they were pacing something out, gone before she could get a proper look. She laughed a little telling me about it, the way you laugh off something that unsettled you more than you want to admit, and asked whether I'd noticed anything odd myself. And I told her no, not wanting to add my own half-formed unease to hers, and watched the two of us talk ourselves into something neither of us could actually prove. I started double-checking the deadbolts on both gates most nights after that, telling myself it was just good habit for a new parent to develop anyway. A couple of weeks later, coming home late from a shift at work, I could have sworn I saw someone standing at the edge of the empty lot directly across from our house. Still and upright in that particular way that doesn't read as a fence post or a mailbox, no matter how much you want it to. By the time I'd parked and looked again, there was nothing there at all, just bare dirt and the dark shape of a half-built frame 2 lots further down. I sat in the car for a good minute longer than I needed to, engine off, watching that empty stretch of dirt through the windshield, before finally convincing myself to get out and head inside. I told myself it had been a trick of the headlights, the kind of shape your eyes and vent out of shadow when you're tired enough after a long shift, and I didn't mention it to Claire, not wanting to hand her one more thing to lie awake, worrying about on top of everything a new baby already gives a person to worry about. The night everything actually happened. I woke sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning to a loud, insistent knocking at our front door, hard enough that I felt it through the floor before I was even fully awake. Claire stirred beside me, and I told her to stay with the baby, pulling on a shirt and heading downstairs with my heart already thudding harder than I wanted to admit, my mind already running through every worst possibility in the half-second it took to cross the bedroom and reach the top of the stairs. Images of broken glass and a stranger's hand already on the doorknob, flashing through my head faster than I could talk myself down from any of them. Rather than open the door itself, some instinct made me go straight for the kitchen window instead. Leaning forward and craning down at that awkward angle to actually see the recessed front step below, and I unlatched it and called out to ask what was going on. There was a man standing right at our door, close enough to the frame that I could only really make out his general shape from that angle, broad-shouldered, wearing something dark. No visible car or bike anywhere on the street behind him that I could make out in the poor light. He shouted back up at me that he was hurt, that he needed help, that I had to let him in so he could call an ambulance, his voice carrying easily in the dead quiet of that empty street. My stomach dropped in that specific way it does when your body understands danger a half second before your mind catches up to explaining why. I had a wife and a 3-month-old baby upstairs in a neighborhood with no other lit windows for 2 streets in either direction, and every instinct I had told me that opening that door was not a thing I was willing to do, whatever story was standing on the other side of it. I remember noticing, even in that first rush of adrenaline, that his voice didn't carry the ragged, breathless quality I'd have expected from someone genuinely injured. It was too steady, too controlled, a performance of pain rather than the real thing, though I couldn't have articulated that difference clearly enough to explain it to anyone in the moment. I told him to stay right there and that I'd call an ambulance for him myself, keeping my voice as steady and reasonable as I could manage. The way you'd talk someone down from something without quite knowing yet what that something was. His whole tone changed the instant I said it, the pleading dropping away into something sharper and angrier, shouting up at me that no, I didn't understand, that he needed to actually be let inside right now, that he was hurt badly, that he was dying, and every second I spent arguing with him through a window was a second closer to that being true. Something in the sudden, practiced fury of it, the speed with which pleading turned to threat the moment I didn't immediately do what he wanted, told me more clearly than any injury story could have that whatever was actually going on out there had very little to do with needing an ambulance. I told him again, just as firm, that I wasn't opening the door, but that help was coming, and turned to go grab the phone from the kitchen counter, my legs feeling strange and unsteady under me the whole short walk across the room. By the time I'd actually dialed and gotten a dispatcher on the line, I'd glanced back toward the window on instinct, and the recessed doorway below was already empty. No sign of him anywhere on the street or the dark lot across from us, gone as completely and as fast as if he'd never been there at all. I gave the dispatcher our address and a rough description anyway, my hands not quite steady on the phone, and she told me a unit would be sent out when one became available, which, in a development that sparse, at that hour, could apparently mean anything. I remember the strange, useless detail of standing there in the kitchen in bare feet and a t-shirt, phone pressed to my ear, staring at an empty doorstep and trying to describe a man I'd only ever heard, never actually seen clearly, to a stranger on the other end of a line who sounded like she'd taken this exact kind of call 100 times before and would take it 100 times again. I stood in the kitchen for a long while after that call, listening to the house, to Claire moving quietly upstairs, settling the baby back down after the knocking had woken her too, telling myself the whole thing was over, that whoever he was had gotten spooked off by the mention of the ambulance and moved on to try his luck somewhere else. There was a strange false calm to those few minutes, the kind you talk yourself into when you badly want a bad thing to already be finished, and I remember actually starting back up the stairs, one hand on the banister, half convinced the worst of the night was already behind us. I hadn't even made it back up the stairs before the banging started again, this time from the back of the house, low and heavy against the door that led out onto our patio, The one door in the whole house I genuinely believed nobody could reach without somehow getting over that fence first. My whole body went rigid on that staircase, 1 foot still on the lower steps, and for a second I honestly couldn't make myself move in either direction, up toward my family or down toward whatever was making that sound. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs for a second, running through the physical impossibility of it even as the sound continued, steady and deliberate, 15 feet of sheer wooden planking, with no footholds standing between that door and the rest of the empty world outside. My mind kept snagging on the sheer logistics of it, refusing to let the fear fully take over until I'd at least tried to make sense of the mechanics. The way you sometimes think in stubbornly practical terms right in the middle of something that should have you too afraid to think clearly at all. I made my way to the kitchen window that faced the backyard, my hand shaking slightly as I unlatched it, and shouted out into the dark that I had already called the police, that they were on their way, my voice coming out louder and harder than I actually felt. The banging stopped instantly, followed by a silence that felt somehow worse than the noise had, thick and listening in a way ordinary silence never quite manages. I stood at that window for a long moment, scanning the dark rectangle of yard I could make out by the faint spill of light from the kitchen behind me, and thought, for one heart-stopping second, that I saw a movement near the top of the fence itself. A shape briefly silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness of the empty lot beyond it, before dropping down out of sight on the other side. My whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the kitchen. The specific, impossible wrongness of watching something that size clear a 15-foot sheer surface in a single motion settling into my chest like a stone. I couldn't have told you in that moment whether I'd actually seen a person clearing that fence in a single fluid motion or simply convinced myself of it out of pure adrenaline, but either way, I grabbed the heavy flashlight we kept by the back door and stepped outside onto the patio myself, unable to stand, not knowing any longer. Claire called down the stairs after me, her voice pitched low so as not to wake the baby, asking what I was doing, and I told her to stay put, to keep the bedroom door locked, that I just needed to check the yard myself before I could let either of us settle back down. My bare feet against the cold concrete of the patio felt absurdly exposed in a way they never had before, and I remembered gripping that flashlight tighter than I needed to, some part of me half expecting a hand to close around my ankle from somewhere in the dark grass the moment I stepped off the patio itself. The yard was empty by the time I got the flashlight beam moving across it, grass undisturbed, the gate itself still deadbolted exactly the way I'd left it before bed. It was only when I swept the light along the base of the fence, close to the far corner nearest the empty lot, that I found the scrape marks, a series of ragged gouges torn into the wood about shoulder height, paired with a matching set lower down near the ground, the kind of marks a boot might leave scrabbling for purchase against a smooth surface that offered absolutely nothing to grip. I ran my own hand over the higher set of gouges, feeling the splintered wood catch rough against my palm, trying and failing to picture the physical mechanics of a climb that would leave marks in exactly those two places and nowhere else along that entire 15 feet. Caught on a splinter jutting out from one of those gouges was a torn scrap of dark fabric, damp and cold between my fingers when I finally worked up the nerve to pull it free, denim by the feel of it, nothing else about it distinctive enough to tell me anything useful. I held that scrap up to the flashlight beam for a long moment, half expecting it to explain something, and it told me nothing at all, except that whatever had happened at that fence had been real enough to leave a piece of itself behind. I stood out there a long time after that, flashlight sweeping the same stretch of fence over and over, as though staring at it long enough might explain how a grown man could have gotten 15 feet up a sheer wooden surface with nothing to climb, dropped down into a yard, banged on a locked door, and then made that same impossible climb back out again in the time it had taken me to cross from the kitchen to the patio. The math of it simply refused to work no matter how many times I ran it through my head, and somewhere underneath the fear I felt something close to insult. The sense of a thing I'd built with my own two hands, something I genuinely trusted, having been proven wrong in the worst possible way. I went back inside eventually, checked every window latch on the ground floor twice, and sat at the kitchen table with the flashlight still in my hand until I heard a car finally pull up outside, close to an hour after my original call. The two officers who came out walked the property with me, flashlights of their own sweeping the same yard I'd already gone over a dozen times. And one of them whistled low at the fence itself, running his hand along the gouge marks the way you'd examine a wound, saying he'd genuinely never seen anyone manage a climb like that without proper gear, some kind of harness or grappling equipment, and finding none of that anywhere in the yard either. His partner asked me twice, carefully, whether I was certain the marks hadn't already been there before that night, some scuff from construction equipment or a previous owner, and I told him just as carefully that I'd built that fence with my own hands the summer before and knew every board on it, and that those marks had absolutely not been there when I'd checked the gate before bed. They walked the empty lots on both sides of our property, too, flashlights bobbing off into the dark for what felt like a long time, and came back with nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt that led anywhere useful. No sign of a car that shouldn't have been parked where it was. They took a description of the man's voice, which was all I really had to offer, wrote down what I could remember of the exchange at the front door, and told us to call again immediately if anything else happened before they finally left sometime near dawn. Claire and I didn't sleep the rest of that night, sitting together in the kitchen with the baby monitor between us, both of us jumping at every ordinary creak the house made, settling as the sky slowly lightened outside. She kept asking me, quietly, whether we'd done the right thing not opening that door, whether a man really hurt and dying could have been telling the truth the whole time, and I honestly didn't have an answer for her that made either of us feel any better. Only the certainty, gut deep and impossible to argue with, that letting a stranger into a house with a 3-month-old baby in it at 3 in. The morning had never once, at any point that night, felt like the right thing to do. At one point, she got up to check on the baby again, though the monitor had shown nothing but steady, even breathing the whole time, and I understood exactly what she was actually checking for. The same thing I kept catching myself listening for every time the house went quiet for more than a minute. I left for work a few hours later than usual, exhausted, moving on autopilot as I unlocked the front door to head out to my car, and that's when I saw it sitting on the recessed step, tucked neatly against the frame, as though someone had placed it there with real care rather than tossed it in passing. It was a bottle of wine, ordinary enough at a glance, the kind you'd find on the bottom shelf of any grocery store, except for the handwritten paper label taped crookedly across the front of it, the kind of thing you'd stick on a homemade gift. The writing on it, uneven and slightly smeared at the edges, read simply, "Wine, thanks for the help." I stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, one hand still on the handle, my brain refusing at first to properly connect the bottle in front of me with anything that had happened only a few hours earlier, the whole scene almost too ordinary looking to make sense of. I called Claire out to look at it before I touched a single thing, and we both stood there, staring down at that bottle for a long moment, neither of us quite willing to say out loud the thought clearly sitting behind both our eyes. The front door still standing open behind us, the morning air cold against my bare feet on that same recessed step. The color of that writing wasn't the deep purple red of wine or the black of standard ink. but something closer to a dried, rusty brown, thick in places where the pen or brush or whatever had made it had pressed down harder, thin and streaky in others where it had clearly been running low, exactly the way a pen runs dry, when there's nothing left in it to write with except whatever's already smeared across the tip. Claire crouched down close enough to read the label without touching it, her face going pale in a way I'd never seen outside of the delivery room, and told me, very quietly, that she didn't want that bottle anywhere near our house, not for one more minute than it took me to get rid of it. She wouldn't let me throw it in our own outdoor bin either, insisting I carry it 2 streets over to the public bin by the half-built model home instead, gloves on the whole way there and back, refusing to let it sit anywhere near our property for even the length of a single garbage collection cycle. We never poured a drop of it out to check, never opened it at all, and to this day, neither of us has ever managed to fully explain to the other, in words either of us actually believed, what exactly we thought that label had been written in, or why a man who'd been refused entry into our home not 8 hours earlier would have left us a gift at all, let alone one framed as a thank you for help we'd never actually given him. I called the same 2 officers back that afternoon to tell them about it, and they came out again, photographed the bottle and the label from every angle before I carried it off to the public bin, and told me they'd log it as part of the same incident report, though neither of them offered any theory at all about what it might mean or who might have left it, only the same careful, professional blankness I'd already come to expect from them. We lived in that house another 4 years after that night, and nothing quite like it ever happened again, though I never stopped checking the deadbolts on both gates every single evening before bed, running my hand along that same stretch of fence more times than I could count, half expecting 1 year to finally find those scrape marks fresh again, instead of weathered pale and smooth the way they eventually became. Claire started leaving a light on over the back patio every night without fail, a habit she's never fully broken even now, years later, in a completely different house in a completely different city, on a street lined with neighbors close enough on every side that nobody could ever climb anything like that fence again, even if they tried. We eventually sold that house to another young couple, and I remember standing on that same recessed front step the day we handed over the keys, looking down at the exact spot where the bottle had been sitting all those years before, and saying nothing about it at all to the new owners, telling myself there was no kind version of that story I could hand someone on moving-in day. I've wondered since whether I should have said something, whether some responsible part of home ownership includes passing along a warning like that along with the garage door code, and I've never quite settled on an answer I feel good about. Our daughter is grown now, with a place of her own, and I've never told her the whole story in any real detail, only the bare shape of it, the knocking, the fence, the bottle, letting her draw her own conclusions about exactly how much of it to actually believe. I still think about that torn scrap of denim sometimes, tucked away in an old drawer I've moved from house to house without ever quite deciding to throw it out. The one small, undeniable, physical thing that proves to me, on the nights I need proving, that at least some part of that whole impossible night really did happen exactly the way I remember it. Some nights, usually when I'm the last one still awake in whatever house we're living in now, I find myself standing at a back window for no particular reason, looking out at nothing in particular, waiting, the way you wait for a sound you already know is coming. Even in a neighborhood where I know for a fact there's no fence left anywhere close to 15 feet tall for anyone to climb.